It began in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't belong to a room, but to the folds of memory. A boy sat under an endless sky, watching stars flicker like old lanterns. He didn't know yet that each star carried a version of himself, scattered across countless universes, all breathing, laughing, aching at once, and though he was just one Morty, he carried the quiet weight of remembering them all. But tonight, this story isn't only his, it's ours. We tell it softly, with care, because we truly love you and we want you to feel safe here. Before we begin the tale, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. He grew up with a quiet secret pressed gently against his chest, like a folded note no one else could read. From the earliest years, before he even had words for it, there were mornings when he woke with tears on his face, or laughter he couldn't explain, or a name on his lips that no one around him had ever spoken. His parents thought it was nothing. Children dreamed strangely after all. But Morty knew. He knew that the things he carried did not belong entirely to him. At first, it frightened him. How could a child understand that he might hold the weight of 1,000 other children's moments? He was sitting at his school desk, small hands fidgeting with a pencil, when he felt the sudden memory of running barefoot through a desert at night, guided only by the sound of bells tied to a camel's neck. He had never left his neighborhood, had never touched sand, and yet the memory felt like his own. He shook his head and scribbled nonsense on the page, trying to hide the strange tears that had risen without warning. Most children outgrow their imaginary friends, their dream worlds, their illusions. Morty did not. Instead, his imagination grew sharper like a lens that would not stop focusing. He remembered things in patterns, the way another Morty once tied shoelaces with a perfect bow, the way another held his grandmother's wrinkled hand, the way yet another whispered secrets into the hollow of a tree. These flashes arrived without rhythm, without invitation. They were simply there, gentle, stubborn visitors in the small house of his mind. And though he rarely spoke of them, the memories began to shape him. He noticed things others ignored. A classmate's sigh, the weight of silence in a room, the quiver in someone's voice. He could sense loneliness with the clarity of someone who had lived it 100 different ways. He could sense joy as if he had gathered it from countless scattered summers. He did not tell anyone, of course. Even Rick, who seemed to see through most disguises, never asked. Perhaps Rick noticed but chose not to say. Perhaps Rick understood in some hidden way that Morty's quirk wasn't a danger but a quiet inheritance. There were afternoons when Morty would sit outside on the porch, legs dangling, just listening to the wind. To anyone else, the breeze was simply the breeze. To Morty, it was a chorus. Each gust carried echoes of the voices he couldn't quite hold on to, laughter that wasn't his but lived inside him anyway. Sometimes he closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him until the sharp edges of the world softened. One evening, when the sky had turned the color of bruised lavender, Morty found himself watching shadows stretch across the yard. He had the sudden sensation of sitting on a rooftop in another life, watching the same sky, but with different eyes. He couldn't explain it. He didn't need to. It was enough just to feel the quiet thread between worlds like a string tying him gently to unseen selves. This strangeness made him tender. When his mother sighed heavily after a long day, Morty would place his hand lightly on her arm, not saying a word, but giving her something softer than language. When his father's clumsy attempts at fixing things ended in frustration, Morty simply sat nearby, steady and unjudging, carrying the patience of someone who knew that in other lives fathers had fixed everything, and in still others, nothing at all. His friends noticed he was different, though they couldn't explain why. Some called him distracted, lost in thought. Others teased him for drifting off in class, for staring at the sky like it held answers. Morty didn't mind much. He was too busy listening to the subtle music of existence. He carried inside him the knowledge that somewhere, always, another version of him was laughing or crying or running through a field. He carried the understanding that no one was ever truly alone, not even him. And yet, with all of this, there was a loneliness too, because no one else around him remembered what he remembered. No one else woke with the feeling of 100 dreams stitched into their chest. At night, lying in his bed, Morty often whispered softly to himself, as if speaking to the others, "I know you're out there. I know you're real. I'll carry you as best I can." There was comfort in that whisper. There was also sorrow, but mostly there was peace. He didn't need to be understood completely. He only needed to stay open, to let the flood of lives move through him without resistance. He didn't know what it meant, or why it was happening, or whether it would ever end. All he knew was that it was part of him, as natural as breathing, in time. Morty grew used to the strangeness. He learned not to fight it. He learned that the unexpected moments of memory could arrive anywhere, in the middle of brushing his teeth, or walking home from school, or sitting quietly with his grandfather, while tools clicked and sparks flew. The memories did not ask permission. They simply arrived, soft and insistent, like rain on a window. Sometimes, when the weight of it pressed too heavily, Morty found relief in small, ordinary things. A sandwich made just the way he liked it, a warm blanket wrapped around his shoulders, the simple act of noticing how the afternoon light fell across the kitchen floor. These little anchors kept him steady. They reminded him that even with infinite selves, scattered across infinite skies, this version, this boy, in this small home, in this fleeting moment, was real too. He never told anyone about the way his chest tightened when he remembered a Morty who once lost everything. He never shared how his hands trembled when he recalled a Morty who held a child in his arms, safe and loved. He simply carried these echoes quietly, learning the art of gentleness through them. And so, the boy who remembered more than his own, life continued on. He was both ordinary and extraordinary, both just one child and the vessel of countless children. He never claimed to understand it, but he lived it fully. And in the stillness of his own heart, he began to realize something, simple and profound, that perhaps remembering wasn't a burden at all. Perhaps it was a gift, a reminder that love and loss and laughter are never wasted, never gone, but ripple endlessly, like starlight that travels forever, even after the star itself has faded. And with that thought, Morty drifted into sleep, carrying his 1,000 selves into dreams where for a time all the universes folded together into one quiet breath. Rick was always there, moving like a storm at the edges of Morty's quiet world. To others, he was chaos personified. Tools, clattering, portals flaring open, bottles clinking with the dull song of exhaustion. But to Morty, especially when he was small, Rick was something stranger. A shadow of brilliance, a force that didn't belong to any one room. He was both impossibly near and endlessly far, like thunder rolling after lightning. Morty didn't always understand him, but he felt the gravity of his presence, heavy and unyielding. Sometimes, when Rick disappeared for days, Morty almost missed the noise, the sudden flashes of blue light, the acrid smell of metal, the muttered curses that trailed behind him like smoke. And then, just as suddenly, Rick would be back again, stumbling into the kitchen with eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. Morty would be eating cereal at the table, spoon halfway to his mouth, when Rick dropped into the chair across from him without a word. For a few minutes, the only sound was the scrape of a spoon against porcelain, the rhythmic clink of glass bottles shifting in Rick's coat. Morty never knew what to say. He never needed to. Though Rick rarely explained his work, Morty sensed things. He sensed that every invention, every reckless jump through the cosmos, carried its own burden. Rick's shoulders never looked light, and sometimes, when Morty accidentally caught his grandfather's eyes, he saw the faint reflection of what he himself carried. Memories, countless and unspoken, tucked away where no one else could reach. It was like recognizing a scar on someone else that mirrored your own, even if neither of you admitted it. One night, Morty wandered into the garage where Rick spent most of his hours. The place smelled of oil and ozone, sharp and metallic, yet strangely comforting. Machines hummed quietly, blinking with sleepy lights. Rick was bent over a half-finished contraption, his face lit pale blue. Morty didn't say anything. He just stood there, waiting, until Rick finally noticed him. For a moment, Morty thought Rick might tell him to leave, to go to bed, to stop staring. But instead, Rick sighed and pushed the tool aside. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice rough. Morty shook his head. Rick didn't press further. He only pulled up an old stool and gestured for Morty to sit. And so they sat together, surrounded by the strange breathing of machines, without needing to fill the silence with words. It wasn't affection in the way other families might have shown it. Rick never wrapped him in a hug, never whispered reassurances. But sometimes, late at night, Morty felt that his grandfather's presence was its own kind of shelter. Rick didn't soften the world. He couldn't. But he stayed in it. And for Morty, that was enough. The shadow of Rick shaped Morty in quiet ways. It taught him how to sit with contradiction, how someone could be brilliant and broken at once, how someone could be cruel with words but kind with presence, how love sometimes looked like absence, and absence sometimes carried its own form of love. Morty didn't know it at the time, but these lessons would linger in him like constellations half buried in night. At school, Morty often found himself watching his classmates with a patience beyond his years. He saw their outbursts, their laughter, their insecurities. He remembered versions of himself who had lived all those moods, all those mistakes. And he remembered Rick, gruff and relentless, teaching him without teaching him that every person carried a history no one else could see. So Morty learned not to judge too quickly. He learned to listen with more than his ears. On one quiet afternoon, he came home to find Rick asleep at the workbench, head resting on his arms, soft snores filling the garage. A half-empty flask lay on its side, reflecting the glow of a nearby monitor. Morty stood in the doorway, not wanting to wake him. For a long time, he just watched, his heart swelling with a kind of tenderness he couldn't explain. In that moment, Rick wasn't a genius, or a storm, or a shadow. He was simply an old man, exhausted, fragile, still breathing. Morty felt the weight of all his remembered selves. Mortys who never had a Rick. Mortys who lost him too soon. Mortys who never knew what it meant to be cared for, even in fragments. And he whispered softly, almost too softly to hear. "I'm glad you're here." Rick stirred, though he didn't wake, and Morty slipped away quietly, carrying the warmth of that moment with him like a secret candle. As the years stretched on, Morty's quiet secret and Rick's loud shadow wound around each other in strange harmony. Morty remembered universes. Rick built them. Morty carried hearts, Rick carried formulas. Both bore more than they spoke of. And though Morty sometimes wished he could lay it all out, tell Rick about the memories, confess the weight of it, something in him knew that silence was the truest language they shared. So Morty let the days flow. He sat at the dinner table while Rick muttered half-sentences between sips of something bitter. He walked beside him through fields of tall grass on the way back from some experiment gone wrong. He listened to the sound of portal doors closing again and again, like the rhythm of a lullaby only they knew. And in all of it, Morty learned the art of companionship without demand, the way you can love someone without needing them to change, without needing them to understand, simply by being there. There were still nights when the flood of memories overwhelmed him, nights when he woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the echoes of 1,000 Mortys shouting at once. But even then he found solace in knowing that Rick's presence hummed somewhere nearby, as steady as the machinery in the garage. It wasn't comfort in the traditional sense, but it was real. And sometimes real was more than enough. Morty didn't know what would come of this strange inheritance he carried, or what Rick's storm would mean for him in the years ahead. He only knew that life was teaching him, quietly, to hold contradictions gently, to hold love without certainty, to hold memory without possession, and most of all, to hold the people around him with patience, even when they couldn't offer him the same. That night, lying in bed with the hum of the garage still drifting faintly, through the walls, Morty closed his eyes and breathed slowly. He felt the presence of his grandfather in the background, vast and imperfect, and he felt the multitude of selves within him, infinite and tender. And as the two shadows folded softly together in his chest, Morty drifted into sleep, where universes unraveled into silence and silence turned to peace. It was a small thing, so ordinary it could have been overlooked, but to Morty it became a moment he carried for years. One afternoon, while the sky sagged heavy with slow-moving clouds, he sat in the kitchen making a sandwich. 2 slices of bread, a careful spread, a little more mustard than most people would have liked. He wasn't really hungry, he was restless, tired in a way that food couldn't fix. Still, his hands moved through the ritual with quiet precision, as if he had done it many times before in many different kitchens. And in a way he had. Because as he pressed the bread together, he felt the soft rush of memory from other Mortys across other universes. Mortys who liked peanut butter, Mortys who preferred cheese, melted just right. Mortys who ate standing by the fridge with the door still open. The act was so small, so humble, yet it carried with it a vastness that nearly brought him to tears. A sandwich was never just a sandwich. It was proof of all the lives being lived at once, all the tiny comforts that stitched themselves into the pattern of existence. He carried the plate to the porch and sat down. The world outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives only after rain has passed, when everything glimmers faintly and the air feels rinsed clean. Morty took a bite, and the taste filled him with something deeper than flavor. He felt connected, not only to himself in this world, but to every self who had ever sat with food in his hands, needing comfort more than sustenance. The sandwich became a thread, weaving him gently through the universes, and though he was alone on the porch, he felt surrounded by invisible companions. As he chewed slowly, the thought rose in him. Maybe this was the point. Not the grand adventures, not the impossible machines or dazzling portals, but the small, ordinary moments that carried infinite echoes. Maybe the multiverse was less about chaos and more about repetition, about the way the simplest acts were shared across countless lives. A bite of bread, a hum under one's breath, a glance at the evening sky. These were the universe's quiet chorus, sung softly, again and again. Morty closed his eyes and listened. He imagined kitchens of every shape and size, porches overlooking fields, rooftops with neon lights glowing below. He imagined every Morty pausing, tasting, breathing. And suddenly he didn't feel so burdened by his strange gift. Instead, he felt cradled, carried by the ordinariness of it all, carried by the knowledge that even when the world felt vast and unknowable, small rituals could bring it back into his hands. Rick wandered past at one point, muttering something about a part he needed to find. He glanced at the sandwich, raised an eyebrow, and kept walking. Morty almost laughed because he knew Rick saw only bread and mustard, nothing more. And maybe that was fine. Not everyone needed to see the infinite in the ordinary. Not everyone needed to feel the weight of 1,000 lives in a single bite. Morty did. And that was enough. He ate slowly, drawing the moment out, as though time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of his chewing. Between bites, he let his eyes wander up to the clouds. They moved lazily, like ships drifting across a calm sea. For a long while, Morty watched them without thought, letting his mind loosen its grip on everything else. It was a meditation, though he wouldn't have called it that. It was simply being, simply breathing, simply noticing. When the sandwich was gone, he brushed the crumbs from his lap and leaned back against the wooden railing. A breeze passed through, cool and kind, and with it came another flood of memory. This time it wasn't about food. It was about laughter, uncontrollable, bubbling laughter. He remembered sitting in a different body, at a different table, in a universe where someone told a joke so perfect it lit up the whole room. He remembered the ache in his ribs, the way tears rolled down his cheeks, the way he gasped for air between fits of joy. He didn't know who that Morty had been laughing with, or what the joke had been, but he felt the warmth of it all the same. And sitting there on the porch, he smiled softly to himself, as if the laughter still echoed across time. Later, as the light shifted toward evening, Morty picked up the empty plate and carried it back inside. His hands felt steady, his chest lighter. The world hadn't changed, not really. The garage still buzzed with Rick's experiments. The dishes still sat in the sink. His parents still argued softly upstairs about bills or work, or something he didn't fully understand. But within Morty, something had shifted. A kind of acceptance had begun to take root. He understood now that the memories weren't just accidents or burdens. They were bridges. They connected him to countless lives, yes, but more importantly, they reminded him how deeply human even the smallest acts could be. He didn't have to solve the mystery of why he remembered. He didn't have to chase answers or force meaning. He only had to live gently, carrying the echoes like lanterns in the dark. That night, before bed, Morty made another sandwich, this time with care, as if it were a ritual. He didn't rush, didn't glance at the clock, didn't let his thoughts wander. He paid attention to the way the bread softened under his fingers, to the smooth sound of the knife against the plate, to the way the light above the sink buzzed faintly but warmly. It wasn't about hunger. It was about creating a small moment of peace, a small moment of connection. When he finally lay down, the plate clean and the house quiet, Morty felt calmer than he had in days. He closed his eyes and the memories flowed softly, not as storms but as streams. He saw flashes of other kitchens, other hands, other bites, taken in silence, and instead of overwhelming him, they lulled him into sleep, a gentle chorus of universes rocking him the way a lullaby might. And as he drifted off, he thought once more of the simple truth he had discovered, that sometimes the infinite reveals itself not in galaxies or equations or impossible machines, but in a sandwich made with care, eaten beneath a sky heavy with clouds. And with that thought, the boy who remembered too much let himself fall into dreams, soft and endless. The first time Morty noticed her, she wasn't speaking at all. She was standing near the edge of the schoolyard, looking up at the sky while everyone else shouted and ran across the field. Her lips moved faintly, not in words, but in something softer, a hum, quiet and steady, as though she was singing to the clouds themselves. Morty stopped mid-step. The sound wasn't loud, not even meant for anyone to hear, but he felt it stir inside him like a gentle tide. She wasn't the kind of person others noticed quickly. She didn't shout to be heard or pushed to the front. She carried herself like someone who trusted the world to come to her in its own time. And though Morty couldn't have explained why, he felt drawn toward that stillness. It was rare to find stillness in a place so noisy, rare to find someone humming as if the sky were listening. Over the weeks that followed, he began to notice her more often. She always seemed to hum, sometimes while tracing her fingers along the bark of a tree, sometimes as she tied her shoelaces, sometimes when she sat alone with her notebook open, the pencil resting idly between her fingers. Morty never recognized the tune. It wasn't like any song on the radio, not even like something made for others to hear. It sounded like a private melody, a rhythm borrowed from the turning of leaves or the drift of clouds. For a while, Morty said nothing. He simply observed as quietly as she hummed. But one afternoon, while waiting for class to begin, he found himself sitting nearby. The room buzzed with chatter, but her voice floated above it, low and steady. Without meaning to, Morty turned toward her and whispered, "That song, what is it?" She looked up, surprised, as if she hadn't realized anyone had been listening. Her eyes met his, warm but unguarded. "It's not a song," she said softly. "Just something that feels like one." Morty nodded, though he didn't fully understand. He didn't need to. Something about the way she said it made sense beyond explanation. He smiled faintly, and for the first time, she smiled back. From then on, they spoke in small moments, not about much, just fragments of conversation between classes, short exchanges. On the walk home, she never forced words into the air. Instead, she let silence exist, and Morty found comfort in that. So much of his life felt crowded with noise, the hum of Rick's machines, the storm of memories rushing through his chest. But with her, there was space. There was room to breathe. Sometimes she hummed while they walked. At first, Morty worried it would feel strange, but it never did. Instead, it became the rhythm of their friendship, a soft background to their footsteps. He didn't always understand her words, but he understood her hum. And somehow, that was enough. One afternoon, while sitting on the swings after everyone else had left, she tilted her head and asked, "Do you ever feel like you're carrying something heavy that no one else can see?" Her voice was steady, but her eyes searched his face as though the question mattered. Morty's chest tightened. For a moment, he thought of telling her everything, the flood of memories, the weight of universes pressed against his ribs. But he only nodded slowly. "Yeah," he whispered, "all the time." She didn't press for details. She didn't need to. She only began to hum again, the melody low and steady, drifting into the evening air. Morty listened, and for the first time in a long time, the heaviness in him eased. It wasn't gone, but it softened, like a shadow fading under gentle light. Days turned into weeks, and Morty began to look forward to the small moments they shared. He never expected her to fix anything, never expected her to carry the strange burden of his secret. He only treasured the way she reminded him that gentleness existed, that even in a noisy world, someone could hum quietly to the sky and mean it. One day, while they sat beneath a tree after school, she plucked a leaf from the branch above and held it up against the sunlight. The veins glowed faintly, like rivers mapped across a hidden land. "It's funny," she said, her voice barely louder than her humming. "How even the smallest things carry patterns, like they've been waiting to be noticed." Morty watched, the way the light passed through the leaf, and he thought about the memories he carried, the patterns stitched across universes, waiting to be noticed. He didn't say anything, but he knew then that she had touched something close to his truth without even trying. She began to appear in his dreams, not in the overwhelming flood of memories, but in the gentler spaces between. She would hum while standing on a rooftop or walk beside him through strange cities he had never seen, her voice carrying softly over the noise. The dreams were calming, not heavy, not sharp. They felt like reminders that not every connection had to be explained. Not every bond needed to be defined. Some simply existed, steady and kind. Morty found himself humming sometimes too, when he was alone. Not the same melody, not exactly, but something of his own. At first it felt awkward, but then it became natural, like breathing. He realized that perhaps what mattered wasn't the song itself, but the act of carrying sound gently into the world. It was a way of saying, "I'm here, I'm listening, I'm alive." One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air cooled, Morty sat beside her on the curb outside their school. The street was empty, quiet, painted in orange and blue. She hummed softly, and Morty, almost without thinking, joined in. Their voices didn't match perfectly, but that didn't matter. The two melodies drifted together, weaving something fragile and beautiful between them. Morty felt a warmth spread through him, not from memory this time, but from the present moment, the simple, undeniable fact that he wasn't humming alone. For a boy who carried the weight of countless selves, that moment felt like a gift. It was proof that even when no one else could see the burden, even when no one else could understand, there could still be someone who shared the silence with him, someone who hummed to the clouds, someone who reminded him that heaviness doesn't have to be carried alone. It can be softened by the presence of another. That night, lying in bed, Morty thought of her voice and the way it had blended with his. The memories came, as they always did, but instead of overwhelming him, they seemed to hum along with the melody he still carried in his chest. He drifted into sleep with the thought that maybe, across the universes, every Morty had someone who hummed to the clouds. And if not, then at least this Morty did, and that was enough. It came to him on an ordinary morning, the kind where the air felt thin and sunlight spilled lazily across the windows. He was sitting in class, barely listening, when a sudden heaviness swept through his chest. His pencil paused mid-scribble. The memory wasn't his. He knew that right away. It was a memory from another Morty, one who had grown up with a brother. The image was so vivid he almost gasped aloud. Two boys running barefoot across a yard, laughter bubbling behind them as though the world itself were chasing but could never catch them. He felt the push of a shoulder against his own, the warmth of someone shouting his name, the kind of joy that comes from knowing you are not alone in the shape of your childhood. Morty's breath caught, and he sat frozen at his desk, the sound of that laughter still ringing inside his ears. When the teacher called his name, he blinked hard and forced himself back into the present. But the echo lingered. For the rest of the day, every empty space beside him, an unused seat, a stretch of hallway, felt filled by the ghost of a boy who should have been there. A brother he had never known, yet missed with a sharpness that ached. At home, Morty moved through the house as if in a dream. His father's voice echoed faintly from the living room. His mother clattered dishes in the sink, and Rick muttered somewhere in the garage. Everything looked the same, but Morty's chest carried the sense that something was missing. Not something, someone. That night, lying in bed, he closed his eyes and let the memory flood back. He remembered a hand tugging at his wrist, pulling him towards some shared mischief. He remembered whispered secrets under a blanket, the kind of promises only siblings made, promises of forever. And though he knew the brother wasn't real in his world, Morty wept softly into his pillow for the bond he felt all the same. The days that followed carried the same quiet ache. He imagined what life might have been like if there had been another child in the house, another presence at the dinner table, another shadow in the hallway. He imagined laughter woven into the silence, imagined fights that ended in forgiveness, imagined the comfort of someone who understood without explanation. The longing wasn't dramatic, not loud, but it was steady, humming in him like a low note he couldn't stop hearing. One evening, Morty sat on the porch again, watching the sky soften into dusk. The humming girl walked by, and when she saw him, she paused. "You look sad," she said gently. Morty hesitated, then nodded. "I remembered something," he whispered. "Someone." She tilted her head, not pressing, just listening. That was enough. Morty closed his eyes and described it. Not in detail, not the strange truth of his gift, but simply the feeling of it. It was like having someone who always understood. Like I was supposed to have him, but he isn't here. His voice broke slightly, but the words were soft, careful. She sat beside him, quiet for a moment, then began to hum. The melody was slow, lower than usual, almost like a lullaby. Morty let the sound settle over him, and in that sound he felt the echo of companionship. Not the same as the brother he longed for, but something near it, something close enough to remind him that bonds come in many shapes, not all of them bound by blood. Later that night, as he lay awake, Morty thought of the other Morty, the one who had grown with a brother by his side. He wondered if that Morty ever thought of him in return, if across universes there was another boy lying in bed, missing the brother he once knew but could not find. The thought was strangely comforting, as though longing itself could be shared over time. The ache softened. Morty learned to carry it without being crushed. He found ways to honor the bond that never was. When he laughed with the humming girl, when he sat silently near Rick, when he offered his parents patience they didn't always notice, he felt as though he was channeling the brother he had never met, living out that connection in new forms. It wasn't the same, but it was something. And sometimes, when he felt the loneliness pressing too heavily, Morty would whisper softly to the dark, as if speaking across universes, "I know you're out there. I'll remember you. I'll keep you close, even from here." In return, he often felt a warmth bloom in his chest, subtle and fleeting, but real enough to ease the weight. It was as though the brother answered back, not in words, but in presence, reminding Morty that bonds are never fully gone, even when they can't be seen. One night, as he drifted towards sleep, Morty dreamed of sitting at a table with the brother. They didn't speak. They only sat side by side, sharing a sandwich, the simplest of meals, but filled with quiet comfort. Morty woke with tears on his cheeks, but they weren't heavy tears. They were light, almost grateful. He carried that dream with him in the days that followed. It became a reminder that even imagined bonds could shape a life, could soften loneliness, could teach him how to love more deeply. He didn't have to question it, didn't have to prove it real. The memory was enough. The heart always knew what it needed, even when the world did not provide it. And so, Morty lived on with a ghost brother stitched into his chest, not a burden, not a wound, but a quiet companion, reminding him always that he was more than one boy, more than one story, more than one life. He was part of something larger, something infinite, where every bond mattered, even the ones that never existed here. That night, as he fell asleep once more, Morty whispered into the dark, not with sorrow but with peace, "Good night, brother, wherever you are." And with that, the weight in his chest loosened, and the boy who remembered too much drifted gently into dreams, carried by love he had never held but always known. There were mornings when Morty woke and could not tell which memories were his own and which belonged to other selves. The line blurred softly, like fog stretching across a quiet field. He would sit at the edge of his bed, rubbing his eyes, while echoes of strange lives drifted through him. A Morty who played the violin in a dim-lit room. A Morty who lived in a desert town where the wind carried sand like whispers. A Morty who was taller, braver, lonelier. They came and went without warning, leaving impressions like footprints in damp earth. At first, he tried to resist them, to push them away. But resistance was like fighting the tide. The memories slipped through, gentle but insistent, until he accepted their presence. He realized that each memory, no matter how foreign, left him with something he could use, a softness, a way of seeing, a small kind of wisdom that lingered after the images faded. One morning he remembered a universe where Mortys grew flowers that glowed faintly at night. He could almost smell them, delicate, sweet, like a lullaby carried in the air. For the rest of the day, every lamplight he passed seemed softer, as though reminding him of those blossoms. Another time, he remembered sitting on a dock beside a river, throwing pebbles into the water with an old man who might have been a grandfather. The ripples in the dream lingered, and Morty found himself noticing how even his smallest actions carried outward in ways unseen. These glimpses were not always kind. Some left him shaken, quiet for hours. He once felt the sharp sting of a Morty who had lost everything in a fire, the sound of crackling wood still alive in his bones. He remembered holding a hand that turned to ash, and though it wasn't his loss, the grief stayed heavy for days. Yet even then, something inside him whispered that the sorrow too was a gift, a reminder of how fragile it all was, and how much could be treasured before it was gone. Rick noticed eventually. He never said it outright, but Morty caught him watching, with a kind of wary curiosity. One evening in the garage, Rick set down his tools and muttered, "You look different, Morty. Not older, not smarter, just different." Morty shrugged, unable to explain. How could he tell Rick that he carried thousands of lives inside him, that he felt both more himself and less himself every day? How could he explain the comfort and ache of remembering things that never belonged to this world? So instead, he just said softly, Maybe I'm growing up. Rick snorted but didn't push. For Rick, that was as close to acceptance as Morty could hope for. Still, Morty found himself wondering if Rick somehow knew. If perhaps, in his endless experiments and wanderings, Rick had seen Mortys like him before. The thought unsettled him, but it also comforted him. Maybe he wasn't completely alone in this strange unfolding. As the weeks passed, Morty began to notice how the memories changed the way he treated people. At school, when a boy dropped his books and others laughed, Morty bent to help. The boy blinked, surprised, as if kindness was unexpected. Morty didn't think much of it, but later, walking home, he remembered another Morty who had once been left alone in a crowded hallway, his books scattered and ignored. That memory had stung. Helping now felt like an answer, a way to heal something, across time and space. With his family too, the changes were subtle. He listened more carefully to his mother's tired sighs, sensing stories unspoken. He lingered a little longer when his father rambled, hearing in his words a lonely yearning for recognition. Even with Rick, in the silence that often stretched, between them, Morty felt patience he might not have had before. Every relationship seemed woven with hidden threads, and Morty felt those threads more clearly now. At night, when he lay down, the memories came most strongly. Sometimes they arrived as fragments. An old lullaby hummed in a voice he didn't recognize, the texture of sand under bare feet, the weight of holding a small child's hand. Sometimes they came whole, long dreams that felt like borrowed lifetimes. Morty let them wash over him, no longer resisting. He began to see them less as intrusions and more as gifts, as if the universe itself trusted him to carry these fragile pieces. The humming girl noticed too, one afternoon as they walked together. Along the cracked sidewalk, she said, "You've changed." Her voice wasn't accusing, just observant, kind. Morty smiled faintly and asked, "For better or worse?" She shrugged, then hummed a soft note that wavered in the air. "For deeper," she finally said. The word lingered in him. Deeper. That was exactly how it felt. Not better, not worse, not clearer, just deeper. As though his heart was slowly sinking into the world, touching layers no one else could see. In quiet moments, Morty wondered why him? Why this ability, this burden, this gift? He thought of all the Mortys across all the worlds and how most of them lived without this weight. He felt both chosen and cursed. Yet slowly he began to understand that maybe there was no reason, no answer. Maybe it was simply what he was meant to hold, the same way some people held music or art or faith. His gift was memory, not of his own life alone, but of many lives, stitched together like a patchwork quilt. And in that quilt, he began to see patterns. A thread of longing, a thread of kindness, a thread of sorrow, a thread of quiet joy. They repeated across Mortys, across universes, across time. Different shapes, different colors, but always the same threads. It comforted him to know that even in endless variety there was a sameness beneath it all. That in every world Morty was still Morty, still human, still searching for love and meaning. One evening, as he drifted towards sleep, Morty whispered to himself, "Maybe that's the point, to carry it all, to remember so none of it is lost." And with that thought, his breathing slowed, and he sank gently into dreams. The dreams that night were quiet. No vivid lives, no sharp griefs, just the soft image of stars above a still lake, their reflections rippling slightly in the water. Morty stood at the edge, watching them shimmer, feeling as though they were both infinite and fragile at once. He didn't need to move, didn't need to speak. The stars spoke enough, reminding him that even scattered light could belong to the same sky. And when he woke the next morning, Morty carried that peace with him, tucked gently in his chest like a secret. There was a night when the house felt unusually quiet, as though every wall had taken a breath and was holding it. Morty lay awake, listening to the silence. It wasn't empty, not really. It carried a softness, like the hush before snowfall. He turned on his side and watched faint shapes on the ceiling, shadows of branches swaying outside his window. They looked like reaching hands, or maybe like threads weaving patterns across the plaster. The memories drifted in as they always did, but slower, gentler. This time he found himself walking through a small town built entirely of lanterns. Each house glowed softly, its walls translucent, lit from within by a flame that never burned out. The streets shimmered with light, warm and steady, as though the whole place breathed with a calm heart. Morty felt himself walking slowly down those lantern-lined paths, not rushing, not searching, just moving with quiet belonging. He remembered no faces, no voices, only the glow, and when he woke, his chest carried the same warmth. The next day, he walked through his neighborhood with different eyes. Houses looked plain, walls ordinary, yet he imagined tiny flames inside each one, small hopes, small lives, small kindnesses. He thought about how easily they could be overlooked from outside, and yet how brightly they must burn when you stepped in. The thought softened him, even when he passed strangers who never looked up. The humming girl noticed. They sat together on the curb after school, and she asked, "Why are you smiling at nothing?" Morty shrugged. "I was just thinking, maybe everyone's glowing inside even if we don't see it." She tilted her head, her hair falling across her cheek, and after a long pause, she said, "That sounds nice." Then she hummed a few notes, low and slow, like the sound of lanterns if they could sing. Rick, on the other hand, seemed restless that week. His experiments grew louder, sharper, as if he were pushing against something invisible. Morty caught him staring at the ceiling once, muttering to himself, a flask dangling loosely from his fingers. Morty wanted to ask, but instead he sat nearby in silence, offering presents without words. He wasn't sure if Rick noticed, but later, when Morty stood to leave, Rick's voice came rough and tired. "You're a strange kid, Morty. But maybe not the worst kind of strange." Morty carried those words like a pebble in his pocket, small but grounding. Rick rarely offered anything resembling tenderness, but when he did, it stayed. The memories kept weaving through Morty's days. One afternoon he remembered walking barefoot through endless fields of grass, each blade tipped with dew that caught the sunlight. The air smelled of morning, even though he didn't know what time it was. In that memory, he wasn't searching for anything, just breathing, moving, being. The simplicity of it stayed with him, and for the rest of the day, every small thing, the sway of a tree, the sound of water in pipes, felt like part of a greater rhythm. But not every memory was peaceful. One night he jolted awake, breath caught, after recalling a Morty who stood at the edge of a broken world, sky cracked like glass, oceans gone dry. The silence in that place was unbearable, pressing, final. He had felt that Morty's loneliness like a stone dropped into his chest. For hours afterward, Morty stared at the ceiling of his own room, grateful for every small sound, the hum of the fridge, the rustle of leaves, his own steady breathing. The humming girl seemed to sense his heaviness the next morning. She walked beside him, quiet for a long time, then gently bumped his shoulder with hers. "You don't have to tell me," she whispered, "but I'll still listen." Morty felt his throat tighten, but he only nodded. Sometimes her presence was enough, her simple offer more comforting than explanation. In the quiet stretches of the week, Morty began to notice how his memories, strange as they are, were shaped not only how he felt but how he moved in the world. He paused longer before answering people, sensing more beneath their words. He looked more carefully at small details, a chipped cup, a faded photograph, a sigh hidden in someone's voice. It was as if the universe had stretched his attention, teaching him that everything, no matter how ordinary, carried its own quiet meaning. One evening, he wandered out to the backyard and lay down in the grass. The stars shimmered faintly above him, and for a moment he felt himself connected to all the Mortys across the infinite expanse. Each star, he thought, might be another him, shining in its own way, carrying its own burdens and blessings. He closed his eyes and imagined them humming together, a chorus of selves, not in harmony, not in dissonance, but in a kind of patient coexistence. The image brought him peace. He felt less alone, as if no matter how strange his gift was, it tied him to something larger, something unbreakable. The grass beneath him felt like a cradle, and for a while he drifted between waking and dreaming, balanced on the edge of both. Later, when he returned inside, his mother looked at him strangely. "You've been quieter these days," she said. Her voice wasn't worried, just curious. Morty thought about telling her, about confessing everything, but the words stuck. Instead, he smiled faintly and said, "I'm just thinking a lot." She reached out, smoothed his hair the way she hadn't in years, and said, "Don't think yourself away, okay?" He promised he wouldn't, though part of him wondered if that was already happening. The humming girl walked with him again, the next day, their steps falling into rhythm. She hummed a tune he didn't know, soft and winding. Morty listened closely, feeling the melody sink into him like warm water. After a while he said, "That sounds familiar, even though I've never heard it before." She looked at him with a knowing expression. "Maybe it's because you've heard it somewhere else." He didn't ask what she meant. He already understood. That night, Morty dreamed of the lantern town again. Only this time, as he walked its glowing streets, he saw shapes moving behind. The luminous walls, shadows of people, indistinct but alive. Their lives flickered softly, each one private, fragile, but all together creating the town's glow. He woke with tears on his cheeks, though he didn't know why. He sat at the edge of his bed, breathing slowly, and whispered to the empty room, "I'll remember for you. All of you." The words felt like a vow, quiet but binding. He didn't know who he was speaking to, other Mortys, strangers in distant universes, the shadows in the lantern town, but he knew it mattered, and with that whispered promise, he lay back down. The shadows of branches still moved on his ceiling, weaving their slow patterns, and Morty let them carry him gently into sleep. Morning arrived with a pale, silvery light that slipped through Morty's curtains. He sat up slowly, feeling that familiar tug of weight in his chest, the sense of waking not only from one night's dream, but from countless other lives flickering in his mind. He rubbed his eyes and tried to hold on to one memory, but it dissolved, like mist, leaving only the echo of a sound, like bells ringing somewhere far away. At breakfast, the world felt ordinary again. His mother poured coffee, his sister scrolled on her phone, and Rick shuffled in, hair wild, eyes clouded with half-slept thoughts. Yet to Morty, everything carried a strange softness, as though the walls and faces were part of something he had already seen. He chewed his cereal quietly, hearing the bells in the back of his mind, and wondered if anyone else could feel the faint shimmer that filled the morning. Later that day, Morty walked alone toward the edge of town. The streets grew quieter the farther he went, until houses gave way to open fields. The sky stretched endlessly, clouds drifting like unhurried ships. He found himself slowing down, each step lighter than the last. His mind filled with fragments. A Morty who lived by a river of glass, another who planted seeds that grew into trees of light. He couldn't hold them all, but he didn't need to. Just knowing they existed filled him with a sense of companionship, invisible but steady. He reached a small hill and sat down, the grass brushing against his hands. The world felt wide and gentle, and for a while he simply breathed. In that quiet, a thought came. Maybe the memories weren't meant to be understood, but simply carried, like lanterns in the dark, glowing softly, guiding him not with answers, but with presence. The humming girl found him there. She sat beside him without a word, knees drawn close, her eyes on the horizon. After a long silence, she began humming a tune, slow, wistful, like the sound of wind through reeds. Morty listened, and the bells in his mind seemed to weave themselves into her melody, as though her song was a place where the worlds could rest together. When she stopped, Morty whispered, "Do you ever feel like you're remembering something that isn't yours?" She looked at him thoughtfully, then smiled faintly. "All the time. I think maybe songs remember for us, even when we don't know them." Her words settled into him like a seed finding soil. That evening, Morty returned home with the tune still echoing in his chest. Rick was in the garage, surrounded by clinking tools and half-finished machines. Morty stood at the doorway, hesitant, then said, "Do you ever feel like you've been everywhere, even if you haven't?" Rick didn't look up, but his voice carried a weight that surprised Morty. "Kid, you don't want to feel that, trust me. Too many places, too many versions. It can tear you apart if you're not careful." Morty hesitated. "But what if it doesn't tear you apart? What if it just makes you softer?" Rick finally turned, studying him with narrowed eyes. There was no mocking in his gaze, only a weariness Morty couldn't fully name. "Maybe you're not built like me," Rick said quietly. "Maybe that's not the worst thing." Then he went back to his work, leaving Morty with a warmth that surprised him. That night, the bells returned more clearly than before. Morty dreamed of walking through a vast hall lined with doors, each one glowing faintly. Behind each door, he sensed a different version of himself, laughing, grieving, wandering, resting. He didn't open any of them. Instead, he walked slowly, listening to the bells that rang from somewhere above, steady and patient, like time itself breathing. When he woke, the sound still lingered, as though it had followed him back. The days began to carry a rhythm after that. Morty walked through his life with quiet awareness, noticing how each small thing felt like part of something larger. The sound of pages turning in a classroom, the way dust shimmered in sunlight, the soft pause before someone answered a question. He no longer tried to explain it, even to himself. He simply let it be, like waves lapping at the shore. The humming girl stayed close, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent. Her presence felt like a steady thread, something he could hold when the memories grew heavy. One afternoon she told him, "You don't have to make sense of everything. Some things are just meant to be carried, like lullabies you hum without knowing the words." Morty nodded, and though he didn't reply, Her words settled deep inside him. Rick, too, seemed to notice the shift. He didn't ask questions, but his glances lingered longer. His voice carried less impatience. One night, as Morty passed the garage, Rick muttered without looking up. "Whatever you're holding, don't let it crush you. Find a way to let it hold you instead." Morty stopped in the doorway, surprised, then whispered, "I'll try." Rick grunted, and the moment passed, but it stayed with Morty long after. The bells became a soft motif in Morty's nights. They never rang with urgency, never demanded. They simply existed, calling gently, reminding him that he belonged to something wider than his own room, wider than his own world. Sometimes they sounded like glass, other times like water, and sometimes like the faint hum of the girl beside him. Always gentle, always steady. One evening, Morty found himself back on the hill at the edge of town. The sky was painted with fading light, stars beginning to emerge like shy witnesses. He lay back in the grass and closed his eyes. The bells rang faintly, and for the first time he hummed along, letting his voice weave with the sound. The melody was imperfect, fragile, but it felt true. He imagined other Mortys hearing the same bells, humming in their own ways. A chorus scattered across infinite skies, connected not by words, but by resonance. The thought filled him with a peace, so deep it felt endless, as though the universe itself had leaned down to cradle him. When he opened his eyes, the stars were brighter. The night stretched wide, and Morty felt himself small, but not alone, fleeting, but not forgotten. He breathed slowly, and the bells faded, leaving only the steady rhythm of his own heart. And with that rhythm, he closed his eyes again, letting the night carry him gently into sleep. The following morning arrived quietly, almost shy, as though the sky itself had tiptoed into the day. Morty woke with the lingering sense of a dream he couldn't fully remember. There had been doors again, and bells, but also something else, something he could almost feel resting at the edges of his memory, like a letter tucked into a pocket. He sat up slowly, blinking at the pale sunlight filtering through the blinds, and let the stillness of the room hold him. Downstairs, his mother moved about in the kitchen, the smell of toast floating through the air. His sister's voice carried faintly from the living room, sharp with laughter from some video playing on her phone. Morty lingered at the top of the stairs, hand on the railing, feeling the strange divide between the ordinary pulse of his family's life and the unordinary rhythm quietly thrumming in his chest. He didn't resent either. He only wondered how they could live so close to one another, yet breathe such different air. Rick was in the garage again, hunched over a bench littered with tools. Morty approached hesitantly, not wanting to disturb him, but Rick spoke before Morty could say anything. "You've been humming in your sleep," Rick said without turning. His tone was flat, but there was a shadow of something gentler beneath it. "Pretty weird, even for you." Morty flushed, unsure if he should feel embarrassed or relieved that Rick had noticed. "It's just, I keep hearing bells. They follow me into my dreams. And sometimes I think they're trying to tell me something." Rick finally looked up, his face tired but alert. "Bells don't tell you anything, Morty. They just ring. What you hear is what you already wanted to hear." Then he sighed, softer. "But maybe that's not a bad thing." Morty wanted to ask more, but Rick turned back to his work, leaving Morty with that half-answer, heavy yet strangely comforting. Sometimes Rick's words were like broken mirrors. You couldn't see everything, but you saw enough to know you were there. That afternoon, Morty walked with the humming girl again, The sun drifted low, brushing the sky with tender colors, and the air smelled faintly of rain, though no clouds had gathered. She asked him what the bells sounded like this time, and Morty tried to explain. "They're clearer now, not loud, just closer. Like they know my name but don't want to say it yet." She listened, with her eyes half closed, nodding slowly as though she understood something even deeper than what he spoke aloud. As they reached the hill, she began to hum once more. This time, Morty joined her without hesitation, their voices weaving softly together. The sound was fragile, trembling, yet it felt like it belonged to the air itself. When they stopped, the silence that followed was not empty, but full, as though the world had leaned closer just to listen. In the days that followed, Morty noticed how the bells seemed to arrive not only in dreams, but in waking moments too. In the clink of dishes, in the laughter of children outside, in the creak of the school's old floorboards, little chimes hidden in the fabric of the day. He no longer tried to explain them, even to himself. Instead, he carried them quietly, letting them guide him the way shadows guide light. One evening, as Morty sat by his window watching the stars, he thought of all the versions of himself scattered across infinite universes, some lonely, some joyful, some broken, some whole. And he realized that maybe the bells were not separate voices, but one. The sound of all those selves singing softly to each other across the endless dark. The thought made him feel both vast and small at once, and he let the feeling wash over him like a tide. The humming girl told him once, "Every sound we keep inside becomes part of us, like stones in a pocket. Some are heavy, some are light, but they all change the way we walk." Morty thought about that as he lay in bed, the bells faint in the distance, and wondered if maybe the weight he carried wasn't meant to burden him, but to keep him steady. Rick's words, too, stayed with him. Don't let it crush you. Find a way to let it hold you instead. Morty repeated them to himself sometimes, like a prayer, or maybe a reminder. He wasn't sure yet how to let the bells hold him, but he was beginning to trust that he would find out in time. One night, Morty dreamed of walking not through a hall of doors, but through a field of lanterns. Each lantern glowed softly, swaying, in a breeze he couldn't feel. As he passed, some flickered brighter, others dimmed, but all of them hummed with a quiet resonance, the same rhythm as the bells. He walked among them slowly, carefully, as though each step was a kind of listening. At the center of the field, he found a single lantern brighter than the rest. When he touched it, the sound of the bells filled him completely, warm, steady, unbroken. It was not overwhelming. It was simply vast, like a sky he could breathe inside. And when he woke, he carried that sound with him, softer but still there, like a hidden thread woven into his heartbeat. The days after that felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just deeper. Every word he heard, every glance he caught, every small motion of the world seemed touched by the bells, as though life itself had become a quiet song. He found himself smiling more often, not out of happiness, exactly, but out of a kind of wonder. The world had not changed, but he had, and that was enough. One evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars blinked awake, Morty whispered to the night, "I hear you." And for a moment, he thought he heard the night whisper back, not with words, but with the soft ringing of unseen bells, steady as a lullaby. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash through him, and felt himself drifting gently, like a leaf, carried by a calm stream. There was no urgency, no need to hold on. Only the simple rhythm of bells and breath guiding him into a sleep that felt both endless and kind. The morning carried a hush, as though the world had agreed to speak a little softer for a while. Morty stirred slowly beneath his blanket, his breath warm against the cool air. He didn't rush to rise. He stayed there, letting the quiet hold him, listening to the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Time moved, but not with urgency. It drifted, like clouds across a forgiving sky. When he finally stood, his feet pressed gently against the wooden floorboards, and he felt the faint vibration of life beneath the house. Somewhere, his family moved about, the sounds muffled and ordinary, yet strangely tender. It was in these moments, between waking and stepping into the day, that Morty sensed the bells most clearly. Not loud, not demanding, just a steady resonance, like a memory remembering itself. At school, the halls were alive with chatter, but Morty walked through them as though surrounded by glass. He wasn't apart from it all, not really, but he moved with a softness that made him feel like he belonged to something else as well. He noticed how the sunlight hit the windows, bending in faint arcs across the tiled floors. He noticed how the laughter of others echoed differently now, not sharp, but rounded, almost melodic. It was as though the bells had taught him how to listen. During lunch, he sat with the humming girl under the shadow of an old oak tree. She peeled an orange slowly, her fingers careful, each piece released with gentle patience. Morty watched the motion, the way the fruit glistened in the light, and he felt that small ache of beauty again, the ache of noticing. She handed him a slice without speaking, and when their fingers brushed, he felt the bells hum through him, as if in agreement. They didn't speak much. Sometimes their silence was the conversation, long stretches of air filled with unspoken understanding. But when she did speak, her words carried the weight of something more than their sound. "Do you ever think," she asked, gazing at the grass, "that maybe the bells aren't outside us at all? Maybe they're just the part of us that remembers we're not alone?" Morty let the thought rest between them. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned it over carefully in his mind, the way one turns over a stone in a stream. "Maybe," he said finally. "But if that's true, it means they'll never stop. Even if we don't hear them, they'll keep ringing." Her eyes softened, and she smiled faintly. Exactly. That night, Morty sat in the garage with Rick. The air smelled of oil and faint smoke, and the glow of the workbench lamp threw long shadows across the walls. Rick was working on something unnameable again, wires coiling like roots from the machine. Morty watched quietly until Rick broke the silence. "You've changed," Rick said, not unkindly. "You're quieter. Like you're listening to something no one else can hear." Morty hesitated. He wanted to explain, but he didn't know if Rick would understand, or if he even wanted to. "I guess I'm just noticing things more," he said carefully. Rick snorted softly, but it wasn't dismissive. "Noticing's dangerous, Morty. Most people spend their lives trying not to notice. Makes things easier." He leaned back, eyes tired, but sharp. "But if you're gonna notice, then don't waste it. Let it shape you, not break you." Morty nodded. He didn't say thank you, but he felt it. And maybe that was enough. Later, lying in bed, Morty stared at the ceiling and thought about Rick's words. Let it shape you, not break you. He wondered if the bells were shaping him, slowly, gently, like water smoothing a stone. And if so, what shape would he become? He didn't know, but the thought didn't frighten him. It comforted him, the way unknown paths sometimes do when you trust the direction of your own steps. In his dreams, the lantern field returned, but this time the lanterns moved, not swaying in place, but drifting slowly through the air like fireflies. Morty walked among them, and each one glowed brighter when he passed, as though recognizing him. He touched one, and it flickered warmly, the hum of the bells deepening. Then another and another, until the whole field shimmered with gentle light. When he awoke, the memory of the dream lingered. It wasn't a message exactly, not a lesson. It was simply an experience, soft and wordless, that stayed with him. He carried it through the day, letting it settle into the rhythm of his breathing. One afternoon, he found himself walking by the river near town. The water moved lazily, catching fragments of sunlight on its ripples. Morty sat on the bank, watching the current, and realized how similar it felt to the bells. Both constant, both gentle, both carrying more than they revealed. He let the sound of the water fold over him, a lullaby not written, but remembered. As dusk approached, the humming girl joined him. She didn't ask why he was there. She simply sat beside him, her presence as natural as the river itself. For a long while, neither spoke. Then she began to hum softly, her voice blending with the sound of the water, and Morty felt the bells stir within him in reply. It was as though all three, the girl, the river, the bells, were speaking the same language without words. When she stopped, the silence that followed was rich, not empty. Morty whispered, almost without realizing, "I think I'm starting to understand." She didn't ask what he meant, she just smiled, and in her smile was the same understanding he carried inside himself. That night, Morty fell asleep quickly, the bells carrying him gently into the dark. There were no doors this time, no lanterns, no vast halls. Only stillness. And within that stillness, the faintest echo of bells, steady as breath, endless as stars. He didn't wake startled. He didn't wake restless. He woke simply as though rising from the same rhythm that had held him all night. For the first time in a long while, he felt not only rested, but whole. The sky that morning was pale, almost translucent, as though it had been rinsed with quiet water before the sun climbed up. Morty walked slowly through the neighborhood, his backpack loose against his shoulders. He wasn't in a hurry, though the world around him seemed to rush, cars sliding by, voices calling out, dogs barking faintly from porches. He let all of it pass, as though he were inside a slower current, one that moved at the pace of breath. Every so often, he glanced upward. Clouds shifted like paper lanterns across the sky, drifting in their unbothered way. He thought of the lanterns, from his dream, glowing brighter when he touched them, filling the field with their quiet fire. The memory felt like a secret pocket he could reach into whenever the noise of the world pressed too close. At school, things felt ordinary again, but Morty noticed that ordinary was different now. He saw the way his teacher's voice softened when calling on the shyest student. He saw the boy at the back of the room doodling, his lines messy but patient, each drawing more careful than the last. He noticed the dust that danced in the sunlight, suspended for just a moment before vanishing into nothing. All of it seemed to hum in the same key as the bells. During lunch, he found himself sitting under the same oak tree with the girl. She wasn't humming this time. Instead, she leaned back, eyes closed, her face tilted toward the sun, as if soaking in its warmth. Morty sat beside her quietly. After a while, she opened her eyes and asked, "Do you ever wonder if maybe we dreamed this world before we lived it?" He blinked, caught off guard, but not unwilling. Like it all existed inside us first? She nodded, plucking a blade of grass, rolling it between her fingers. Maybe, and when things feel familiar, like those bells you hear, it's just us remembering the dream we already made. Morty thought about that long after she stopped speaking. He didn't know if it was true, but he liked the softness of it. He liked the way it took the weight off of mystery, turning it into something tender instead of frightening. He wanted to believe the world was dream-shaped, made of echoes and gentle reminders. That evening, Rick was in the garage again, tinkering with another device. Sparks leapt into the air, flashing bright before fading into darkness. Morty lingered in the doorway, not sure if Rick wanted company, but unable to walk away. Eventually, Rick noticed him. "What's on your mind, Morty?" His tone was gruff, but there was room in it for an answer. Morty stepped inside, leaning against the workbench. "Do you ever feel like everything's connected in a way we can't see?" Rick gave a half smirk, half sigh. "You're asking the wrong guy, or maybe the right one. Depends on how much you want to know." He adjusted a dial on the machine, sparks settling. "Yeah, it's connected, more than you'll ever map out. Doesn't mean it makes sense, doesn't mean it owes you anything, but sometimes it's enough just to notice the threads without pulling them." Morty absorbed the words. They felt heavy, but not crushing. They felt like stones you place carefully in your pocket to remind yourself of where you've been. Later, that night, Morty sat at his window watching the dark stretch wide across the neighborhood. Street lamps hummed faintly, insects circling their glow. He listened carefully, waiting for the bells. At first, he thought they wouldn't come. Then, as the quiet deepened, he felt them again, soft, patient, almost shy. They weren't far away. They were inside him like a steady pulse, like the rhythm of waves touching shore. Sleep carried him easily. And in his dream, there was no field of lanterns, no endless hall, no doors to open. Instead, he found himself standing in a small room, plain and empty, with one window. Through the window, he saw a night sky, scattered with stars, more than he had ever counted before. The bells rang faintly, weaving with the starlight, making the silence feel full. He didn't need to move. He didn't need to search. Just standing there, breathing in the soft glow, was enough. When he woke, the memory of the stars stayed with him. He carried it into the day like a candle hidden in his chest. At school, when voices grew loud or assignments weighed heavy, he returned to that dream, the stillness of the window, the infinity of the sky. And suddenly, everything around him softened. One afternoon, as he walked home, he noticed a child standing at the corner, crying quietly. Morty stopped, unsure of what to do at first, but then, without thinking, he knelt down and asked softly, "Hey, are you okay?" The child shook their head, tears streaking down their cheeks. Morty didn't try to fix it, didn't offer solutions. He just stayed there, quiet, letting the child cry until the sobs slowed. When the child finally whispered, "I lost my way," Morty took their hand gently and helped them find the street they belonged to. It wasn't much. But as he walked away afterward, Morty felt the bells ring inside him, steady and approving, as though kindness itself was their favorite song. That night lying in bed, Morty realized something. The bells didn't only guide him through dreams or moments of wonder. They rang when he was present with someone else, when he listened, when he noticed, when he cared. They weren't just his secret. They belonged to everyone, even if not. Everyone could hear them. With that thought, sleep came gently again. In the dream, he stood at the riverbank with the girl. She was humming softly, the water moving like a silver ribbon beside them. He listened, and for the first time, he hummed. Back quiet, uncertain but honest. She turned to him, smiling. And together their voices blended with the bells, filling the night with a sound both new and ancient. When he opened his eyes to morning, Morty felt lighter, as though he had grown taller in the night, not in his body, but in the way he carried his heart. The morning light arrived slowly, slipping through the curtains like a whisper. Morty stirred awake, blinking into the pale glow that softened every edge of his room. He lay still for a long time, not ready to leave the warmth of his bed, listening to the quiet that felt more alive than silence usually did. Somewhere, a bird called, its note rising and falling as if answering a question only it could hear. Morty thought about the dream from the night before, the riverbank, the humming, the way his voice had joined hers. He could still feel the echo of it in his chest, faint but steady. It was different from the bells, though it lived in the same space inside him. It was softer, like the beginning of a song not yet finished. He closed his eyes, breathing in the memory as though it could last forever. At breakfast, his family bustled around him. His sister grumbled about homework. His parents moved in their usual rhythm: toast, coffee, small exchanges about schedules and plans. Morty ate quietly, letting their voices wash over him. He wondered how many hidden melodies lived inside each of them, how many secret dreams or bells they carried, but never spoke of. He wanted to ask, but the words stayed tucked inside, not yet ready to be born. Later that day, he walked through the park, taking the long way home. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and cut grass. Children played near the swings, their laughter bright against the stillness. Morty paused near the pond, watching ripples spread from a single duck's slow glide. He crouched, at the edge, tossing a pebble into the water. Circles expanded outward, touching one another, fading only after they had given all they could. He thought of the bells again, how their sound seemed to spread the same way, invisible ripples moving out from him into the world. Maybe every act, every word, every small kindness worked the same. Nothing stayed contained, everything touched something else. The thought filled him with a gentle kind of awe, one that made the world feel tender and fragile, like glass you could hold only with open hands. That evening, Rick called him into the garage. A strange device sat on the table, pulsing faintly with blue light. Rick leaned against a stool, looking uncharacteristically thoughtful. "You've been quiet lately, Morty," he said, voice low. Morty shifted, unsure how to answer. "Just noticing things, I guess." Rick studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Noticing's dangerous, but it's also the only thing that matters. Most people don't. They run fast, loud, blind. You—" He paused as if choosing his words carefully. "You're hearing things they'll never hear. Don't lose that. Even if it makes you lonely, sometimes." Morty didn't know what to say. Rick's words felt like a hand placed gently on his shoulder, heavy with meaning, but not crushing. He nodded, and Rick returned to his work, sparks flashing again in the dim. That night, when Morty lay down, he didn't wait for the bells. Instead, he let his thoughts drift like leaves on water. Sleep came, slow and easy, and he found himself standing once more in the plain room with the window. The stars were brighter tonight, so many that they seemed to press closer, as if eager to be seen. The bells rang faintly, woven into their glow, and Morty felt no need to move. The stillness was the lesson. The waiting was the journey. But then, just as he began to sink deeper, a shadow appeared beside him. It was the girl. She didn't speak, but her presence filled the room with warmth. Together they stood at the window, watching the sky. After a long silence, she whispered, "Do you hear them?" Morty nodded. "I always do." Her smile was small, soft, like the first curve of a crescent moon. "Good. Then you'll never be alone." When he woke, her words lingered like a thread, tying the dream to the waking world. He carried them with him as he dressed, as he moved, through the day, as he sat once more under the oak tree at school. She wasn't there this time, but her absence felt less empty. It was as if the tree itself held her memory, humming faintly in the wind. In class, Morty found himself staring at the blackboard, not at the equations written there, but at the chalk dust that clung to the edges, glowing faintly in the light. He realized that he was beginning to see everything differently, not just as objects or moments, but as small notes in a greater melody. Even the quietest details seemed to sing when he paid attention. On his way home, he stopped again at the corner where he had once found the lost child. The street was empty now, but Morty could almost hear the echo of that moment, the sobs, the hand in his, the relief. He realized the bells hadn't just rung for him that day. They had rung for the child too, guiding them both to safety. And maybe, just maybe, every person carried their own hidden chime, waiting to be heard when kindness touched them. That evening, as the sun sank low and shadows stretched long across the streets, Morty sat outside on the porch steps. He watched the horizon fade from gold to purple, then to deep blue. Fireflies blinked softly in the grass, tiny lanterns echoing his dream. He leaned back, breathing slowly, letting the night wrap around him. And in that moment, without trying, without searching, the bells rang louder than ever before. Not sharp, not demanding, just steady, like a hand pressed gently against his heart. He closed his eyes, listening, and for the first time he understood. The bells weren't calling him somewhere else. They were calling him here, to this exact moment, to the stillness and the stars, to the breath rising and falling in his chest. It wasn't about where he would go or what he would become. It was about noticing the quiet beauty of now. And as he let that truth settle inside him, Morty felt something ease, like a knot gently untangling. Sleep found him easily that night. In his dream, he walked not through lantern fields or endless halls, but through a quiet street that looked very much like his own. Each house glowed faintly, each window humming with unseen songs. The bells followed him, not leading, but accompanying, like old friends walking at his side. He smiled in his sleep, and somewhere beyond the dream, a bird sang again, soft, patient, certain that morning would come. The days began to fold into one another, each carrying a quiet rhythm, like pages. In a book slowly turning themselves, Morty walked through them with a soft awareness, noticing details others might have overlooked. The way sunlight caught on a puddle, the way laughter echoed differently in the open air than it did inside a classroom, the way even silence seemed to hold a texture if he sat with it long enough. It wasn't that the world had changed, it was that he had. The bells, the dreams, the girl, they had opened something inside him that would not close again. He carried this opening everywhere, sometimes like a gift, sometimes like a burden, but always with a sense of inevitability, as though he had been chosen for it long before he knew. One afternoon, he wandered into the library. The air was hushed, touched with the faint scent of dust and paper, as if the room itself breathed more slowly than the outside world. He traced the spines of books without reading their titles, simply feeling the weight of so many lives and stories resting together. He sat at a table near the window and opened a book at random. The words on the page blurred into his own thoughts, and soon he was drifting in that half-dream state where waking and imagining are the same. In that drifting, he felt the bells again, not ringing loudly, but trembling like a string pulled taut across the sky. He closed the book, letting the feeling wash through him. It seemed the bells were always strongest when he was still, when he stopped reaching and simply allowed the world to arrive. On his walk home, he passed the oak tree again. The girl wasn't there, but the space where she had been seemed alive, as though her presence had left a mark on the air itself. Morty sat beneath the tree, leaning against its rough bark, and for a long time he said nothing. He let the wind speak for him, carrying leaves in small spirals, whispering against his cheeks. Somewhere a memory stirred. The way she had smiled when she asked if he heard them. That smile felt like a promise, like a lantern still burning somewhere he couldn't see. That evening, his grandfather found him sitting outside again. Rick lowered himself into the chair beside him with an uncharacteristic patience, a flask in his hand but untouched. For a while, they simply sat together, listening to the hum of cicadas, the distant barking of a dog, the quiet settling of the night. "You're hearing them now, aren't you?" Rick said finally. Voice rough but not unkind. Morty hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, all the time?" Rick exhaled slowly. "Most people never do, and when they finally realize, it's usually too late to change the way they live." He turned, the flask in his hand, watching the light catch on its metal curve.
"You've got time, Morty. Don't waste it." Morty didn't know what to reply. He felt the weight of the words, heavy and tender, all at once. He wanted to ask if Rick had ever heard them, if he had once known this same secret music. But
he didn't. The silence between them was answer enough. That night, Morty's dreams shifted again. He found himself walking along a shore that stretched into forever. The sand was pale, cool beneath his feet, and the waves whispered as they rolled in and out, carrying a rhythm older than memory. Each time the water touched his toes, he felt the bells echo faintly in his chest, as though the sea itself was part of their chorus. Ahead, he saw lanterns bobbing on the water, hundreds of them, drifting outward in a slow procession. Their light shimmered across the waves, each one carrying something unseen, something sacred. Morty walked closer, and for a moment he thought he saw her, the girl, standing at the water's edge, her reflection stretching endlessly. She raised a hand, not in greeting, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement, as if to say, "You are part of this too." When he woke, his room was quiet, the first pale light of dawn touching the ceiling. He lay still, breathing softly, letting the dream linger. The image of the lanterns stayed with him through the day, filling even the simplest moments with a kind of reverence. He ate breakfast slowly, noticing the steam rising from his tea, the way it curled before disappearing. He walked to school with deliberate steps, feeling the ground steady beneath him, each footfall an echo of the bells. In class, he listened more than he spoke. When a friend nudged him with a joke, he smiled quietly, holding the warmth of the connection, even as the words faded. During lunch, he sat near the window, watching clouds drift lazily across the sky. He thought of how everything moved. Clouds, bells, lanterns, even people, carried forward by something unseen yet undeniable. That evening, Morty sat once more beneath the oak tree. This time, he whispered into the wind, not expecting an answer, but needing to give his voice to the silence. "I hear them," he said softly. "I hear them everywhere." And for just a heartbeat, he thought he felt the bark warm beneath his
hand, as if the tree itself was listening, as if it had always been listening.
He closed his eyes, resting against it, and let the moment carry him into stillness. As night fell, he climbed into bed with the ease of someone who had already begun to dream. He didn't search for the bells. He trusted they would come as surely as breathing. And when they did, ringing softly in the space between waking and sleep, Morty smiled. They no longer felt mysterious or foreign. They felt like home. The bells were not leading him away. They were teaching him how to stay, how to be present, how to see, how to carry the quiet beauty of each moment as if it were the rarest thing in the world. And as the dream returned, carrying him once more to the endless shore where lanterns drifted into eternity, Morty stepped forward with no fear, no questions, only listening, only breathing, only being. The mornings had begun to feel slower, as though the world itself wanted Morty to notice the small things before they slipped
away.
When he opened his eyes, he found himself lingering on details that once seemed too ordinary. The way light curved along the wall, the faint creak of the house shifting in its own sleep, the sound of footsteps outside that belonged to people. He didn't know, yet still felt connected to. He carried that softness into the day. His walks to school became less about getting somewhere and more about existing in the space between. The air itself seemed fuller, as if it carried invisible threads tying one life gently to another. Sometimes he touched the bark of a tree or let his hand graze a fence as he passed, reminding himself that every surface had its own memory, its own quiet story. At school he found his gaze wandering often. While the teacher spoke, his eyes rested on the dust motes floating in the shafts of light, and he felt an odd comfort knowing that even the smallest particles carried the same sunlight that warmed the earth. When friends spoke to him, he listened, more than before, not just to the words, but to the pauses, the breaths, the unspoken longing that often lived in silence. He realized how much could be heard in what was not said. One afternoon, he lingered by the oak tree again. Its branches swayed slowly, as though reaching for something they could never quite hold. He pressed his hand against its trunk, waiting, listening. The bells were there, softer now, as if folded deeper into the world. They didn't call urgently. They simply hummed like a presence that would not leave. He sat down beneath the tree, closing his eyes. The memory of the girl came back, not sharp, but hazy, like a dream half-remembered. Her voice seemed to ripple through him. "Do you hear them?" Morty whispered back. "Yes, I still hear them." For a moment he thought the leaves above him stirred differently, as though the tree had understood. That night he dreamed again, but the shore was not as it had been. This time the lanterns drifted more slowly, and the sea was calm enough to reflect the stars above in perfect symmetry. Morty walked along the water's edge, listening to the hush of the waves. He didn't search for anyone. He simply allowed the scene to unfold, letting the quietness soothe him. At one point, he bent down to touch the water. It was cool, but not cold, and as his fingers brushed the surface, circles spread outward, overlapping endlessly. Each circle seemed to carry a faint echo of the bells. For the first time, he thought perhaps the dream was not only showing him a place, but teaching him how to listen. The water, the lanterns, the shore, they were all part of the same song. When he awoke, he lay in stillness for a long time, replaying the rhythm of the waves in his chest. The day ahead no longer felt like something to race through. Instead, it felt like something to inhabit carefully, the way one might hold a fragile cup of light without spilling it. Later that day, Morty found himself at the library again. He walked slowly through the aisles, not looking for any particular book. When he stopped, it was before a shelf he had never noticed before. The books there were old, their covers worn, the letters on their spines faded. He pulled one down at random and opened it. Inside, the words were written in a language he couldn't read, but the symbols curved and flowed in ways that felt familiar. He traced them with his finger, not to understand, but to feel. It was enough. The librarian passed by, a gentle figure with kind eyes. She glanced at the book in Morty's hands and said softly, "That one doesn't reveal itself quickly. It prefers patience." Her voice was calm, unhurried, as though she too knew something about the bells. Morty wanted to ask her what she meant, but instead he nodded, closing the book and holding it close. Some questions, he realized, were answered simply by carrying them. That evening, the air was cool, touched by the promise of rain. Morty sat outside with Rick again. His grandfather seemed quieter than usual, his gaze lost in the distance. After a while he spoke, not turning his head. "You know, Morty, sometimes the things we hear, the things no one else does, they're not there to explain the world. They're there to remind us we're part of it, even when it feels like we're not." Morty felt the words settle inside him like stones dropped gently into water. He didn't answer, but he leaned back in his chair, watching the sky dim into evening. The first drops of rain began to fall, slow and deliberate, each one leaving a small mark on the ground. He lifted his face toward the clouds and let them touch him. That night, his dream returned once more. He stood again by the sea, the lanterns still drifting, but now there was something new. A single boat, small and weathered, tied loosely to a post. He stepped into it, and though no one rowed, the boat began to drift with the lanterns, carried by a current that seemed both real and imagined. Morty sat in the boat, watching the light scatter across the waves. The bells rang faintly in the distance, blending with the sound of water against wood. He didn't know where the boat would take him, and for the first time he didn't feel the need to know. It was enough to drift, enough to listen, enough to be part of the gentle procession, lanterns and stars moving together into the vastness. When he woke, his pillow was damp from rain that had slipped through the open window. He turned his head, listening to the steady drops outside. The world was still asleep, hushed beneath the storm. Morty smiled faintly. The dream hadn't ended. It had followed him here into waking, and as he closed his eyes once more, allowing himself to sink back into rest, he realized that the bells were no longer something separate, something to chase. They had become part of him, as constant as breath, as quiet as the turning of the earth. The days began to fold into one another with the softness of pages, turning in a book too familiar to rush through. Morty found that time no longer pressed.
On him the way it once did, it moved slower, like an old companion matching his steps.
Even the mornings, which used to carry the sharpness of alarm clocks and hurried thoughts, now felt like a slow unveiling, as though the sun itself rose gently just to see if he was ready. On one of those mornings, he lingered longer in bed, tracing the pattern of shadows across his wall. The shadows looked like waves caught mid-motion, as if the sea from his dreams had stretched into his room. He let himself imagine that the line between waking and dreaming had grown thin, like silk that could be torn with the lightest touch. It comforted him to think the world itself was leaning closer, whispering secrets into his quiet hours. School felt different too. He no longer hurried through the hallways or sat restless at his desk. Instead, he noticed how some students carried silence like a heavy coat, and how others filled every space with noise, perhaps to drown out that same silence. He found kindness in small places, a smile shared, a pencil lent, a glance of understanding when words failed. These moments became his secret lanterns, carried quietly inside. One afternoon, he stayed behind after class. The room emptied slowly, footsteps echoing until the last voice faded away. Morty sat in the quiet, listening. Not for bells this time, but for the stillness itself. The chalk dust in the air caught the light, making the room shimmer faintly. He thought of how much lived, in silence, how much the world said without speaking. It made him feel less alone. Later, under the oak tree, the bells returned. They were not loud, they were never loud, but they carried a softness that settled into his bones. Morty leaned against the trunk and whispered, "I'm still here." It felt silly, but the words seemed necessary. The branches moved gently overhead, and for a fleeting moment he thought he felt the tree lean back toward him, answering without words. That night, the dream shifted again. The boat was still there, drifting with the lanterns, but now the sea stretched wider and the stars above glowed brighter, as if watching more intently. Morty sat with his hands in his lap, waiting, not searching. He realized the dream didn't ask him to act, only to witness, and so he did. As the boat floated, he noticed another figure in the distance, seated in their own small vessel. The shape was blurred, as if half-drawn, but there was a sense of familiarity in the way they sat, still and patient. Morty wanted to call out, but his voice stayed inside, gentle and unspoken. Somehow he knew the figure already understood, even across the distance. The bells hummed softly, binding the silence between them. When he awoke, dawn had barely touched the sky. The house was still asleep, and Morty felt the weight of that silence like a blanket. He moved slowly through the rooms, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of morning. In the kitchen, he poured a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the first light gather across the street. A stray cat walked by, pausing to glance at him as if they shared a secret. Morty smiled faintly, lifting the glass in quiet acknowledgement. Later, Rick found him sitting outside. "You been quiet," Rick said, lowering himself into the chair beside him. His voice carried no judgment, only observation. Morty nodded, unsure of what to say. After a pause, Rick added, "Quiet doesn't mean empty. Sometimes it's just full in a different way." Morty let the words sink in. He wanted to tell Rick about the boat, about the figure in the distance, about how silence no longer frightened him, but comforted him. but he stayed quiet, letting the meaning rest between them like an unspoken truth. Rick didn't push. Instead, they both sat watching the horizon as though it might reveal something if they were patient enough. The following evening, rain came again. It tapped gently against the windows, filling the house with a rhythmic lull. Morty lay in bed listening, the sound blending with the faint memory of waves from his dreams. He imagined the raindrops as countless lanterns falling not into water, but onto the earth, carrying light inward instead of outward. Each drop a reminder that the world was alive, breathing with him. In his dream that night, the boat carried him farther. The lanterns glowed brighter, and the air smelled faintly of salt and something sweet like blossoms carried on the wind. The distant figure was closer now, though still blurred. Morty felt no urgency. He only felt the calm of knowing he was not entirely alone in this drifting. The bells rang faintly, not as a call, but as a reassurance, as if saying, "You are exactly
where you need to be." He awoke with that thought lingering, echoing into the day.
Even the smallest tasks felt touched by it, tying his shoes, brushing his teeth, opening the door to step outside. Each act, however ordinary, seemed like part of something larger, a continuation of the dream he carried in his chest. And so, Morty began to live differently. Not with haste, not with grasping, but with a gentle leaning toward everything he encountered. He greeted the world not with questions, but with presence. And in that presence, he began to understand that the bells were not simply sounds from beyond. They were reminders of connection, threads tying him quietly to every moment, every person, every fragment of time. Morty noticed that as the weeks passed, the bells came to him less like surprises and more like companions. They no longer startled him, no longer seemed like mysteries demanding to be solved. Instead, they drifted in softly, like an old memory returning at the right moment. Sometimes he would hear them when the world was very still, and sometimes they came in the middle of noise, reminding him that even in chaos there was a gentle thread running through. One evening, he sat on the porch while the air carried the smell of rain-soaked earth. The sunset stretched wide across the horizon, fading into bruised purple and tender orange. He breathed in deeply, feeling his chest expand with something more than air, something softer, like calm itself. And then, very faintly, the bells stirred. He didn't lean forward to catch them this time. He simply sat still, letting them pass through him as though they belonged not outside, but within. Inside the house, his family moved about in their own rhythms, voices rising and falling, footsteps crossing each other. Morty felt a warmth in that ordinary soundscape. The small moments that once felt too fleeting now seemed to carry weight. His sister's laughter from another room, the low murmur of the television, even the creak of the stairs, all of it wove into him like threads of a blanket he hadn't realized he needed. He whispered under his breath, "I'm glad to be here." That night, the dream opened with a sky filled with stars, unlike any he had seen before. They pulsed gently, like hearts beating in rhythm, and Morty realized the boat was no longer drifting, but moving with steady purpose. The lanterns beside him burned brighter, not urgent, but confident. Ahead, the blurred figure remained, closer now, almost visible. He didn't strain to see. He only watched with patience, understanding that closeness itself was enough for now. The sea carried him calmly, each wave lifting and lowering him like a slow breath. Morty leaned back, feeling the wood of the boat press against him, and he let the bells ring out in the dream air. They were softer than ever, yet clearer too, as though they were not a sound to be heard, but a truth to be remembered. When morning came, Morty carried that dream with him like a secret folded in his pocket. He walked to school slowly, noticing how the world shimmered in ways he hadn't seen before. The cracks in the pavement looked like tiny rivers, the leaves overhead whispered in patterns, and even the air brushing against his cheek felt like it wanted him to notice it. For the first time, he felt as though he was not just passing through the world, it was walking beside him. During lunch, he sat with a friend he didn't usually talk to. They spoke only a little, about nothing important, sandwiches, the weather, the dullness of math class. Yet Morty felt something shift. It wasn't the words that mattered, but the space they shared in that moment, the comfort of simply being side by side. He realized that bonds were not always built on declarations or deep confessions. Sometimes they were built on quiet companionship, on sitting together without the need for more. That evening, Rick found him again, this time in the garage. Morty was sitting on an old stool, staring at the scattered tools and strange machines that hummed faintly in the half-dark. Rick didn't say much, just grunted and adjusted something on the workbench. But after a while, without looking up, he muttered, "Dreams aren't just for sleeping, you know. Sometimes they leak out. Sometimes they're the truest thing we get." Morty didn't answer. He didn't need to. He felt the truth of those words settle into him like a stone sinking gently into water. Rick didn't explain further, and Morty didn't ask. The silence between them was enough, full and unbroken. When night came, the dream deepened once again. This time, Morty noticed that the sea itself glowed faintly, as if every drop of water carried its own lantern light. The figure in the distance was clearer now, though still not fully formed. But Morty felt no impatience. Instead, he felt gratitude. Each night seemed to offer him another layer, another glimpse, and he understood that the journey itself was the gift. The bells rang like a whisper across the waves, not yet, but soon. He awoke with that phrase in his chest, carrying it into his day like a soft hum. It became a quiet rhythm guiding him through ordinary moments. When a teacher's voice droned on, he remembered. Not yet, but soon. When the sky turned grey and rain dampened his shoes, he whispered it again. It was not a promise of answers, but of presence, of continuity, a reassurance that nothing was wasted, not even waiting. Later that week, he returned to the oak tree. He pressed his palm against the bark, feeling its rough warmth. For the first time, he noticed how the roots spread outward, invisible yet holding everything above. It reminded him of his own quiet threads, the unseen ways he was connected to others. He leaned against the trunk and closed his eyes. The bells stirred faintly, and he thought he heard the tree breathing with him. In those quiet moments, Morty realized something small but important. He didn't need to rush to understand. Understanding would come on its own, like dawn breaking, like lanterns floating toward him in the night. All he needed to do was be present, to let the bells arrive when they wished, to let the figure come closer in its own time. The night that followed was gentle. The dream carried him farther, the sea stretching wide but no longer feeling lonely. The figure was near enough that Morty could almost see their face, though it still wavered like smoke. The bells whispered again, softer than ever, a sound more felt than heard. And in that moment, Morty smiled, knowing he was not alone, not even in the vastness of dreams. The days seemed to lengthen in quiet ways. Morty found himself slowing down, noticing details he once brushed past. He lingered over the waylight, fell through a window, or how the sound of water dripping in the sink carried a rhythm that could almost be mistaken for music. He no longer felt like he was racing through life. Instead, he felt as though he were walking through it, step by steady step, as though the world had agreed to move at his pace. One evening, when the air was cool and restless with the coming of autumn, Morty sat at his window. He pulled the blanket over his shoulders and let the night stretch before him. The sky was clear, the stars calm. And then, almost expected now, the bells rang. They didn't rush in. They floated gently, as if shy, and Morty let them settle into his bones. He whispered, "I hear you," though no one was there to listen. Somehow that felt enough. At school he grew quieter, but not in the way that once came from shyness or unease. His silence now felt deliberate, like space he was making for others. When his classmates spoke, he watched them closely, not to judge, but to see them more clearly. He noticed the way one of them fiddled with his sleeve when nervous, how another laughed too loudly when she wanted to be accepted, how even the teacher's voice softened when she mentioned her family. Morty didn't always speak, but he understood. Rick, watching from his cluttered workspace, noticed the change too. One evening, while tightening a bolt on a machine Morty couldn't name, Rick said without looking up, "You're carrying something. Not heavy, but steady. Don't lose it." Morty nodded. He didn't need to explain that the weight he carried was the bells, the dreams, the patience that seemed to bloom inside him. Rick seemed to understand without words anyway. That night, the dream opened not with sea or stars, but with a field of grass stretching endlessly in all directions. The air was thick with the hum of unseen creatures, a sound that was neither warning nor welcome, only presence. Morty walked through the grass, which swayed higher than his waist, brushing against him in waves. Far in the distance, he saw the boat waiting, resting not on water but on the field itself, as though it had been carried there for him. He stepped into it with ease, the wood familiar beneath his hands. The lanterns glowed softly, pulsing in rhythm with his heart. The figure was there too, closer than ever, still blurred, but no longer distant. Morty felt their gaze, though he couldn't see their eyes. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The bells rang across the field, soft and circular, as though coming from nowhere and everywhere. When he woke, the memory clung to him like dew. He carried it into the day, and he noticed how even ordinary things began to feel extraordinary. The sound of shoes scuffing across tile, the faint smell of pencil shavings, the way sunlight bent through the classroom window, it all felt like part of something larger. He thought, maybe this is what it means to remember more than one world at once. Later that week, Morty's sister asked him to walk with her to the store. She spoke quickly, skipping between topics, hardly pausing for air. Morty listened, nodding, not because he had responses ready, but because he wanted her to feel the fullness of being heard. At one point, she stopped mid-sentence and frowned at him. "You're different lately," she said. "But, it's not bad. You feel calm." Morty smiled softly and said, "I guess I just notice things more now." She shrugged and kept walking, but her hand brushed against his for a moment longer than usual. That evening, Morty sat under the oak tree again. The roots seemed even larger now, spreading wide and steady beneath the earth. He leaned back and let his eyes drift shut. The bells stirred faintly, and this time he whispered a thank you. He wasn't sure who he was thanking, the bells, the tree, the dream, or simply the quiet. It didn't matter. Gratitude itself was enough. That night, the dream returned him to the sea, but it was different. The waves were smaller, the current calmer, almost as though it had slowed to match his own breath. The figure was seated opposite him in the boat now, still blurred but nearer than ever. Morty felt no fear, no urgency. He only felt a tender curiosity, the kind that asked nothing, only opened its palms. The bells echoed faintly, and in their sound Morty thought he heard the shape of words, not spoken, not written, but felt, a promise without form. He awoke before dawn, the house still and shadowed. He wandered to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat at the table. The silence felt full, not empty. He thought about how each moment seemed to hold more now than it used to, how even the waiting between dreams was part of the dream itself. Later that morning, he told Rick, "I don't think I'm supposed to figure everything out." Rick didn't turn from his workbench. "Good," he said. "Figuring everything out ruins half of it. Better to sit in it, let it breathe." Morty smiled at that. He realized that Rick, for all his noise and chaos, understood the quiet tubes. The week slipped by. Morty noticed how his own presence seemed to ripple outwards. A friend who was usually restless sat longer at lunch when Morty was near. His sister leaned against him during a show without explaining why. Even Rick, though, still sharp-tongued, spent more time beside him without complaint. Morty didn't set out to change anything but the bells, the dreams, the stillness. They seemed to move through him into others, like lantern lights spilling past the edges of glass. One night, before falling asleep, Morty whispered into the darkness, "I'm ready when you are." The bells didn't answer immediately, but when the dream came, the figure across from him raised their head, and though their features were still blurred, Morty felt the warmth of recognition. Not the recognition of meeting someone new, but the recognition of remembering someone who had always been there. The dream ended softly, fading not with abruptness but with the slow drift of dawn light. Morty woke with peace, carrying the image of the blurred figure in his chest. He no longer needed clarity. Nearness itself was enough. The season shifted almost without notice. The air grew cooler, evenings darker, mornings softer. Morty found himself walking slower on his way home, listening to the sound of dry leaves crushed underfoot, the faint rustle of wind weaving through branches. It was as though the world was whispering its own kind of lullaby, one he had not paid attention to before. He breathed it in, let it rest in him, and thought, maybe every season has always been singing, and I'm only just now listening. At dinner, his sister asked him why he had been staring at the window so often. Morty hesitated, then said simply, "I like the way the sky changes." She rolled her eyes, but he caught the faint smile tugging at her lips. Even she, he thought, probably noticed more than she admitted. Sometimes it was easier to hide wonder than to speak it out loud. That night, he returned to the oak tree. He traced the grooves in its bark with his fingertips, each one a map of time. He whispered to it as though it could hear him, "Do you remember me?" The wind moved through its branches, scattering a few brittle leaves across his shoulders. Morty closed his eyes. It felt like an answer. When the dream came, it opened with silence. No sea, no field, no sound of bells. Only a dim light, as though he stood in a hallway stretching endlessly in both directions. The walls shimmered faintly, lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. Morty felt no fear, only a strange calm. He walked slowly, passing door after door. Behind one, he heard laughter. Behind another, soft weeping. Behind a third, nothing at all. He did not enter. He only kept walking, listening. At the end of the hallway, a single door stood closed. He reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, the bells returned. Soft, distant, almost pleading. Morty turned and found the boat waiting once more, though it floated not on water or grass, but on the air itself, suspended as though weightless. He climbed in, and the lanterns flickered alive. Across from him, the figure sat with stillness, their shape clearer now. The blur was thinning, like mist dissolving at dawn. Morty wanted to speak, but the bells swelled and filled the silence for him. They rang not as a warning, but as reassurance, a reminder that some things only needed to be felt, not spoken. He lowered his gaze, folded his hands together, and breathed with the rhythm of their sound. For the first time, he felt the dream and the waking world touch each other as though they overlapped for a brief moment. When he opened his eyes the next morning, he expected the peace to fade. But it didn't. It stayed with him, threaded through, his breath like quiet thread through cloth. He walked through his day lighter as though each step rested on something unseen. At school, he smiled at strangers more easily. When someone dropped their books, he bent to pick them up without hesitation. These were small things, almost invisible, but they felt like ripples extending outward. That evening, Rick handed Morty a strange device, no bigger than a pocket watch. "Keep it," Rick said. "It doesn't do anything spectacular, just hums softly. I thought you'd like it." Morty turned it over in his hands. It did hum faintly, like a bee in a distant garden. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet. Rick shrugged, pretending it wasn't important, but Morty saw the faint glimmer in his eyes. Later that night, he held the device against his chest as he drifted into sleep. The hum merged with the bells when the dream arrived, and he felt as though the two sounds braided together. The boat rocked gently on calm water, and the blurred figure lifted their hand slightly, as if to reach for him. Morty didn't move, but he felt the motion settle deep inside him, like a promise waiting patiently. Days passed in a rhythm that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Morty still went to class, still walked home, still sat under the oak tree. But everything held more weight, more softness, more presence. He found himself speaking less and listening more, and in that listening he discovered a richness he had never noticed. Even silence between conversations felt alive, as though it carried meaning of its own. One evening, his sister asked him, "Do you ever feel like you're here and not here at the same time?" Morty blinked, surprised by her words. He thought carefully before answering. "Yeah, I feel that all the time now." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, satisfied, as though she had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Morty didn't tell her about the bells or the boat. He didn't need to. She had her own version of it, he realized, even if she didn't name it the same way. That night, the dream returned with the hallway of doors again. Morty walked slowly, listening to the sounds behind them. Laughter, weeping, silence, whispers. He wondered if each door was a memory from some other life, or perhaps from another version of himself. But when he reached the closed door, at the end, he didn't reach for it this time. Instead, he sat on the floor before it, leaned his back against the wood, and closed his eyes. The bells came then, wrapping around him like a blanket. He realized that not every door needed opening. Some could simply exist, waiting while he rested beside them. When he woke, dawn light spilled into his room, faint and golden. The hum of Rick's device still vibrated faintly in his hand. Morty smiled. He thought of the blurred figure, the doors, the boat, the bells, and realized they were not separate things. They were threads, weaving together into something larger than he could yet name. And perhaps naming wasn't the point. That day he walked home, slower than usual, stopping at the corner to watch the sky. Clouds drifted lazily, shifting shapes. One looked like a lantern, another like a bell. Morty whispered to himself, "I see you." The world didn't answer, but in his chest he felt the reply. That night, as he drifted towards sleep, he thought of the blurred figure reaching for him, of his sister's unexpected words, of Rick's quiet gift. He realized he was not walking this strange path alone, and that, more than anything, filled him with peace. The days carried him forward as softly as waves that do not crash, but only lap at the shore. Morty began to notice how even the most ordinary sounds, the creak of a chair, the sigh of wind, through a crack in the window, the quiet shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, held a rhythm that spoke to him. He wondered if perhaps he had always been living inside a music he couldn't hear until now. It was not a melody with instruments or voices, but something woven into the air itself. One afternoon, Morty sat with Rick in the garage. The old man tinkered with a half-broken gadget, wires scattered like tangled veins across the bench. Morty didn't ask what it was. He only watched, curious about the way Rick's hands moved, steady despite the faint tremor of age. For a moment, Rick looked up and caught Morty staring. "What?" he muttered. Morty shook his head, smiling. "Nothing. Just, you look calm when you work." Rick huffed, pretending to brush it off, but Morty thought he saw the corners of his mouth soften. That night, Morty dreamed again, the boat. The waters this time were not endless seas, but a still lake, its surface smooth as polished glass. Stars reflected above and below, so that he seemed to be floating in two skies at once. Across from him the blurred figure remained, but less blurred now, like fog thinning in the morning light. Morty leaned forward slightly, curious, but stopped himself. Something told him not to rush. That clarity arrives only when invited by time. The bells rang, softer than ever, and Morty realized they sounded almost like laughter, or maybe a memory of it. When he awoke, the memory lingered. He carried it through the day, almost like a lantern tucked into his chest. People seemed kinder, though perhaps it was simply that Morty had become more willing to notice. A classmate asked him to borrow a pen, and Morty handed it over with a smile that surprised even himself. Later, when someone dropped their lunch tray, Morty knelt to help pick up the pieces. These were tiny things, forgettable in the grandness of the world, but Morty felt they mattered. Each one seemed to echo into something larger, though he couldn't say what. As autumn deepened, the oak tree at the edge of the yard grew bare. Morty visited it often, brushing his palm against its trunk, whispering to it like an old friend. "You don't look empty," he said once. "You look like you're resting." The wind blew softly, scattering a few remaining leaves, and Morty smiled at the thought that maybe trees listened in their own way. One evening, his sister joined him under the tree. She leaned against the trunk and asked, "Do you ever feel like the world is teaching us something, but it won't say it outright?" Morty looked at her in quiet surprise. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's like, it doesn't give answers, just feelings." She sighed, leaning her head back. "Maybe that's enough." Morty didn't reply. He only sat beside her in the silence, letting it be full instead of empty. That night's dream was different. Morty found himself not on the boat, but walking through the hallway of doors once again. Only this time, one door stood fully open. Inside he glimpsed a field bathed in moonlight, soft grass bending under a wind he couldn't feel. He didn't step inside. Instead, he stood at the threshold, watching, listening. The bells did not ring this time. Instead, the humming from Rick's small device filled the dream, steady, low, comforting. Morty pressed his hand to the doorway as though to say, "I'll come back when it's time." Then he turned and continued walking. In the waking world, the changes within him grew harder to hide. He spoke more softly, moved more slowly, listened more fully. Friends noticed, though few commented, but Rick noticed. One afternoon, as Morty lingered in the garage, Rick said without looking up, "You're not the same kid you were months ago." Morty blinked. "Is that good?" Rick smirked faintly. "Good? Bad? Doesn't matter. You're growing. Just don't lose the parts that make you you." Morty thought about that for a long time. He realized he didn't fully know what himself meant yet, but maybe that was the point. He was still becoming. The dream that night returned to the lake. The blurred figure lifted their hand once more, and this time Morty felt his own hand rise without thinking. Though the space between them remained, the gesture felt complete. No words, no explanation, only presence. The bells whispered faintly, not as commands but as reminders. You are not alone. You have never been alone. Morty's chest tightened with a warmth that bordered on ache, a longing both sweet and heavy. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him. When morning came, Morty sat at the edge of his bed, the small device still humming faintly in his hand. He thought of the blurred figure, of the boat, of the doors. He thought of his sister under the oak tree, Rick's quiet gift, the laughter of strangers, the silence that no longer felt empty. All of it seemed to braid together into a single thread pulling him forward. He didn't know where it was leading, but he trusted it. Trust, he realized, was another word for rest. Later that day, as the sun sank low, Morty sat by the window and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know
Exactly who he was thanking. The blurred figure, the bells, the tree, his family, the world itself.
maybe all of them, maybe none. But as the words left him, he felt a gentle reply ripple through the air, like a sigh, like a hand on his shoulder. And that was enough. That night, when the dream returned, Morty did not wait for the boat to appear. He simply closed his eyes within the dream and let the bells guide him. The lake, the stars, the hallway, the doors, they flickered in and out, as though layers of the same place. The blurred figure stood before him, and though Morty still couldn't see their face, he no longer needed to. Presence was enough. Together they stood in the silence, in the hum, in the bells, and in that stillness Morty felt whole. The air in the house carried a different quiet now. Not silence, exactly, but a layered hush, like the calm between breaths. Morty noticed it most at dusk, when the fading light stretched long across the floorboards and painted the walls in gentle shades of amber. It felt as though the world itself was slowing, softening, making space for something unspoken. He walked through the hallways with care, each step a reminder that he was part of this unfolding, this stillness that asked nothing but presence. In the garage, Rick had left the small humming device on the table. Morty reached for it, holding it in his palms as though it were alive. The hum had grown fainter with time, no longer a steady vibration, but a fragile pulse, as if it too were growing tired. Morty pressed it to his chest, listening to the quiet thrum through his ribs. For a moment, he closed his eyes and imagined it was his own heart, beating in rhythm with the device, beating in rhythm with everything else. Later, Morty sat by the oak tree. The branches were bare now, stripped by the breath of winter, yet the tree still stood steady, its trunk broad and firm. Morty traced the lines of the bark with his fingertips, whispering again to the tree, though he never expected a reply. "You look like you're waiting," he said softly. "And I guess I am too." The wind stirred faintly, carrying the smell of cold earth and wood smoke, and Morty let it brush against his face like an unseen hand. That night, his dream unfolded differently. There was no boat, no hallway, no blurred figure. Instead, Morty found himself in a field of tall grass under a pale moon. The grass moved as though it was breathing, bending with invisible tides. Morty sat down among the stalks, letting them sway against his shoulders, his arms. The sound of the bells was faint, far away, like a memory rather than a call. He lay back and stared at the sky, wondering if perhaps the blurred figure was simply another version of himself, waiting across some unseen mirror. The thought didn't frighten him. It soothed him, like the answer to a question he hadn't realized he'd been asking. In the morning, Morty shared none of this with Rick or his sister. Some things, he had come to understand, were meant to stay folded within. Instead, he poured himself a quiet cup of tea and sat by the window. Outside, the world looked ordinary, buses rolling down the street, neighbors carrying groceries, a dog barking in the distance. But beneath it all, Morty sensed that same undercurrent he felt in his dreams, a hum, a rhythm, a hidden pulse. It made the ordinary beautiful, as though every small act of living carried a secret light. That evening, Rick surprised him by sitting beside him at the table without a word. They both stared out the same window, the silence between them more companionable than conversation. After a while, Rick muttered, "You're quieter these days." Morty shrugged lightly. "Maybe I'm just listening more." Rick gave a short laugh, gruff but not unkind. "That's more than most people ever do." Morty didn't answer. He only leaned back, letting the weight of the moment rest around them like a blanket. In his dreams that night, the blurred figure returned, standing once more at the edge of the lake. The water shimmered under stars that pulsed like steady breaths. Morty approached slowly, unafraid, and though the figure's face remained hidden, their presence felt closer than ever. He lifted his hand again, and so did they. This time, Morty felt a warmth spread through the space between them, not contact, but connection, a bridge made of trust. The bells whispered faintly, a lullaby more than a summons, and Morty felt his eyelids grow heavy even within the dream. The following days carried with them a softness Morty had never known before. Each interaction, no matter how brief, felt touched by something sacred. When his sister laughed, it rang like silver chimes. When Rick muttered under his breath, Morty heard tenderness buried beneath the gruffness. Even the act of tying his shoes in the morning felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though each knot tethered him to the present moment. Walking home one afternoon, Morty paused at a small park. Children played on swings, their laughter soaring higher than the creaking chains. A man sat on a bench reading a newspaper, his face hidden behind its fold. A woman held a baby wrapped in a blue blanket, humming softly to soothe it. Morty stood still, watching, and realized that these strangers too were part of the same rhythm he had come to know. The hum, the bells, the presence. It wove through everyone, not just him. The thought filled him with a gentle awe that made his chest ache in the sweetest way. That night, the dream was quieter still. Morty did not see the blurred figure right away. He walked along the shoreline of the lake, listening to the water, kissed the sand. When he turned, the figure was already beside him, their steps matching his. They did not speak. They did not need to. Morty felt a peace settle over him, a peace that told him he was where he needed to be. The bells did not ring
At all.
Instead, the silence of the dream was its own kind of music. When he woke, Morty lay still for a long while, watching the ceiling as dawn light crept across it. He realized that his dreams were no longer separate from his days. The blurred figure, the boat, the bells, they lived inside him now as part of his breath, his heartbeat, his footsteps, and perhaps they always had. He smiled faintly, letting his eyes close again, not in exhaustion, but in surrender. He trusted the world to hold him, even here in the space between waking and sleep. And as he drifted once more, Morty thought, maybe the journey isn't about finding answers at all. Maybe it's about learning how to rest inside the questions. The days moved like gentle ripples now, stretching outward with no rush, no urgency. Morty often found himself sitting in places he would have once overlooked: the stoop outside the house, the quiet corner of the library, the patch of grass beside the mailbox. Each spot carried its own small rhythm, its own secret music, if he was still enough to hear it. He had begun to notice how even silence was never truly silent. There were always breaths, faint vibrations, the low hum of the world itself, steady and ancient. One evening, as the sky turned to silver and dusk bled into night, Morty wandered down the street until he reached a forgotten bench near the railroad tracks. The bench was worn, its paint chipped by years of weather, but it seemed to welcome him all the same. He sat, listening, as a faraway train rumbled softly in the distance. Its sound was neither loud nor frightening. It was a lull, a rolling heartbeat carrying stories from elsewhere. Morty closed his eyes, imagining each passenger wrapped in their own quiet dream, unaware of the way their lives brushed against his in this moment. The dream that night carried him back to the lake. But the water was calmer than he had ever seen. It stretched smooth and glassy, holding the reflection of stars so perfectly that Morty felt as if he were standing between two skies. The blurred figure was already there, waiting, their shape more distinct, though their face remained hidden. Morty approached slowly, as if stepping into a memory, and this time he sat down at the water's edge without a word. The figure joined him, and together they stared at the mirrored heavens. No bells rang, no whispers stirred. Only the sound of the lake's soft breath filled the dream. When Morty woke, he carried that stillness with him. At breakfast, his sister teased him about the way he stirred his cereal absent-mindedly. Rick muttered about circuits and equations that no one else understood, but Morty only smiled faintly, unbothered. The small irritations that once felt sharp now passed through him like shadows. He had learned to hold them gently, to let them dissolve in their own time. It was as though the dream had taught him that not everything demanded an answer.
Not everything demanded a reaction.
Some things simply asked to be noticed and left untouched. Later that afternoon, Morty walked through town and stopped at a bakery he had never entered before. The warm smell of bread and sugar greeted him like an old friend. He bought a small
roll, and instead of eating it right away, he carried it with him, savoring the weight in his hands. On the corner, he saw a stray cat watching him with slow, cautious eyes. Without hesitation, Morty broke the roll in half and placed it on the
ground. The cat crept forward, sniffed, and then began to eat. Morty knelt quietly, watching, and for reasons he could not explain, his chest filled with a deep tenderness. He whispered, "You don't have to thank me, just eat." The cat didn't look up, but Morty smiled anyway. That night, his dream opened differently. He was not at the lake, nor in a hallway, nor in the field of grass. He was standing in a vast library, the shelves stretching so high they disappeared into mist. Each book seemed alive, its cover pulsing faintly, as though it contained not words, but heartbeats. Morty ran his fingers along the spines, feeling warmth radiate through his skin. He pulled one book free at random, but when he opened it, the pages were blank. The emptiness did not frighten him. Instead, it felt like an invitation. The blurred figure appeared then, standing at the other end of the aisle, watching. Morty lifted the book gently, holding it out, and the figure nodded once before fading back into the mist. When he woke the next morning, Morty carried that image with him. The blank book, the shelves that seemed infinite, the silent nod. He thought about it as he washed his face, as he laced his shoes, as he walked to the edge of the yard where frost glittered on the grass. He wondered if the dream was reminding him that his own story was still being written, that blank pages were not emptiness but possibility. The thought filled him with both humility and comfort. He didn't need to know what came next. He only needed to keep turning the pages one by one with patience. The day passed in a haze of small moments. Morty shared tea with his sister, listening. As she spoke about things that didn't really matter yet, somehow felt important. He sat beside Rick in the garage, watching him tinker, and though Rick never explained what he was building, Morty offered to hand him tools. Rick accepted without comment, and that, Morty realized, was its own quiet kind of gratitude. In the evening, Morty found himself once again by the oak tree. Its bare branches stretched upward, dark against the twilight sky. He rested his back against the trunk and whispered, "I'm still here." The wind answered with a low sigh, wrapping around him like a shawl. That night, the dream returned him to the library. This time, the blurred figure was waiting near a table with two chairs. On the table lay the same blank book. Morty sat down across from them, feeling no fear. Together they placed their hands on the book, and for the first time, faint lines of light began to appear on the pages. Not words exactly, but shapes, like the outlines of stars. Morty's breath caught, and he looked up at the figure. They did not speak. They only turned the page, and more stars appeared. Morty felt a calmness wash through him, deep and unshakable. When he woke again, the dawn was pale and gentle, like a soft veil drawn across the sky. Morty sat up slowly, savoring the warmth of his blanket, the sound of his family moving in the rooms beyond. He realized then that his dreams were no longer simply dreams. They were guides, companions, subtle reflections of what he was learning in his waking life. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "It's all connected, isn't it?" And though no one answered, he felt certain that the world had heard him. The air had shifted, though Morty could not say how. It wasn't colder nor warmer, but it carried a new texture, as though the world itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. He noticed it one morning as he stepped outside, the grass damp beneath his shoes, the horizon still pale, with early light. The silence was different, almost fuller, like the pause between verses of an old song. He stood still for a long time, just listening. It felt as though someone unseen was waiting for him to acknowledge the quiet. As the day went on, this sensation followed him. At the breakfast table, his sister's voice seemed softer, even when she teased him. Rick's muttering carried a different rhythm, more measured, like someone humming under their breath. Even the way the kettle whistled seemed to hold a gentler tone. Morty realized then that he wasn't just noticing the world. He was inside it in a new way, as if every sound and movement folded him deeper into its fabric. That evening, he found himself wandering to the same railroad bench where he had once listened to the passing train. The air smelled faintly of rain, though no clouds had gathered yet. He sat, resting his hands on his knees, and simply waited. Soon enough, the train rumbled again in the distance. He closed his eyes and let its low rhythm move through him, not as noise, but as a reminder that life was always in motion. A small part of him wondered how many times he had sat here in other universes, listening to other trains, feeling other nights close in. The thought didn't frighten him. It comforted him. When he fell asleep, the dream did not carry him to the lake or the library. Instead, he stood on a long, winding bridge made of wood that glowed faintly beneath his feet. The bridge stretched across a valley filled with mist. He could not see what lay below, only the endless white fog drifting and swirling. At the far end of the bridge stood the blurred figure, waiting once more. Morty began walking, each step making the bridge hum quietly, like the strum of a distant harp. With every hum, the mist below shifted, forming shapes of memories, moments he had lived, words he had spoken, small kindnesses he had almost forgotten. Morty slowed to watch, humbled by the way the dream remembered for him. When he reached the figure, they did not move. They only turned and gestured toward the valley, as if inviting Morty to see. The mist cleared for a moment, revealing not a place, but a feeling. It was warmth, belonging, the quiet certainty that he was part of something larger. Morty's eyes burned with tears, though no words were spoken. He understood, in that dreamlike way, that the figure was not trying to teach him anything new. They were only reminding him of what he already carried inside. He woke with damp cheeks, though he felt no sadness. Instead, there was a sweetness in his chest, the kind that lingers after hearing a lullaby. At breakfast, he found himself reaching for his sister's hand across the table. She frowned, puzzled, but didn't pull away. Rick raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Morty smiled faintly, holding the moment without explaining it. Sometimes, he realized, gestures mattered more than reasons. That afternoon, Morty walked into town again. The bakery cat was waiting at the corner, tail curling around its paws. Morty laughed quietly and bought another roll. He broke it in half, as before, offering one piece to the cat. But this time he kept the other piece, eating slowly while the cat munched beside him. For a few minutes they shared a meal in silence. Morty thought almost tenderly that the cat was his companion now, though they had no names for each other, no promises. Some bonds were like that, simple, unspoken, enough. The dream that night returned him to the library. The shelves stretched
higher, the mist thinner, the sense of vastness even greater.
On the table lay the blank book again, but this time, when Morty opened it, words began to appear in faint, glowing script. They weren't sentences he could read, they were fragments, echoes, feelings given shape. As he touched the page, he realized They were not someone else's story. They were his own, not just the Morty of this life, but the Morty of countless others. Each fragment shimmered like a thread, weaving together a fabric too wide for him to comprehend. The blurred figure stood nearby, silent, watching him discover what had always been there. Morty didn't feel overwhelmed. Instead, he felt a deep serenity. The pages were alive, but they did not rush him. He turned them slowly, tracing the light with his fingertips, as though savoring the texture of time itself. He looked up at the figure and whispered, "I understand a little more now." And though the figure gave no reply, the silence itself felt like agreement. When he woke, dawn was breaking once again, soft and pink against the horizon. He lay in bed for a long time, listening to the quiet breathing of the house. He thought about the bridge, the mist, the blank book filling with light. He thought about how even the smallest gestures, sharing bread with a cat, holding his sister's hand, were part of a larger story. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was too small. Everything belonged. That evening, Morty went back to the oak tree. Its branches stretched wide against the twilight sky, bare yet strong. He leaned against the trunk and whispered, "Thank you." The wind stirred through the branches, and for a moment he imagined the tree bowing back to him. He closed his eyes, breathing in the earthy scent of bark and leaves, and felt himself exhale in a way he hadn't in years. The dream that night was the simplest of all. Morty stood in a field of tall grass, the sky filled with quiet stars. The blurred figure was beside him, but they did not move, did not speak. Together they watched as the stars slowly shifted, arranging themselves into shapes Morty could almost recognize, faces, places, fragments of his life and the lives beyond. He did not try to name them. He only watched, feeling the softness of the night settle into his bones. When he turned to the figure, they looked almost solid now, almost clear, but still not fully revealed. And Morty understood. Clarity was not the point. Presence was. He woke with a steady heart, carrying the dream like a lantern inside him. The world outside felt gentler, more forgiving. Even Rick's sharp remarks, even his sister's impatience, even the endless hum of ordinary life, all of it folded together into a harmony he had not heard before. Morty smiled, whispering to himself, "It's all part of the song." And as he stepped into the day, he carried the melody with him, certain it would guide him wherever he went next. Morty noticed the days drifting more easily now, as though time itself had softened around him. He no longer hurried through mornings, or counted the hours until night. Each moment felt like a page in a book he was finally willing to read slowly, without skipping ahead. Even the simplest things, pouring a glass of water, tying his shoes, hearing the creak of a door, seemed to hold a hidden tenderness. He wondered how long the world had been this way, waiting for him to notice. One evening, he wandered back to the bench by the railroad tracks. The air carried a faint chill, and the grass swayed with a rhythm that reminded him of breathing. The train passed again, its steady clatter echoing into the night. This time, Morty didn't just listen. He closed his eyes and felt the sound move through his ribs, through his bones, until it seemed like the train was not outside him, but inside, carrying him forward to places unseen. When he opened his eyes, he smiled faintly. "Everywhere is
part of me," he whispered, At home, Rick was bent over his desk, scribbling strange notes and muttering under his breath.
Normally, Morty would have asked questions or felt intimidated by the impossible diagrams scrawled across the papers. But tonight, he simply stood at the doorway, watching. There was something tender in Rick's shoulders, even in their hunched exhaustion. Morty didn't need to understand the science. He only needed to see the man. For the first time, he realized that Rick's brilliance was not the point. It was his persistence, his way of trying again and again, despite everything. That mattered most. Morty stepped quietly to his side and set a glass of water on the desk. Rick glanced at it, then at Morty, and though no words passed, the silence between them felt full. That night's dream returned him to the glowing bridge. The mist below had thinned, and for the first time, Morty could see faint shapes moving. Within it, echoes of people he had loved in countless worlds. Their faces shifted like ripples on water, sometimes clear, sometimes blurred. Morty reached for them, but the figure beside him shook their head gently. He let his hand fall back to his side and simply watched, tears gathering without heaviness. He understood that he could not grasp them, but he could honor them. Presence was enough. When morning came, Morty carried that lesson with him. At the breakfast table, he didn't rush his food or distract himself. He simply sat with his family, noticing the curve of his sister's smile, the sound of Rick sipping his coffee, the warmth of the light falling across the kitchen. He didn't need them to be perfect. He only needed them to be here. Later that day, Morty wandered into town and found himself at the bakery again. The cat was waiting, as though it had known he would return. This time, Morty didn't buy bread. He simply sat on the curb, letting the cat curl into his lap. Its purring vibrated through his hands, steady and soothing, like a reminder that sometimes the smallest lives held the greatest peace. Morty leaned back against the wall, watching the slow movements of people passing by, each wrapped in their own quiet story. He realized then how vast the world was, not because of its size, but because of the infinite smallness contained within it. That evening, he visited the oak tree once more. The branches whispered in the wind, their shadows stretching across the ground like long fingers reaching for the sky. Morty pressed his palm against the trunk, feeling its rough texture under his skin. "You've seen so much," he murmured, "and still you stand." The thought comforted him, reminding him that strength did not always mean movement. Sometimes it meant simply remaining, weathering season after season with patience. When he fell asleep, the dream carried him not to the bridge, nor the library, but to a vast field of lanterns floating upward into the night. Each lantern glowed softly, lifting into the sky like a prayer. Morty watched them rise, hundreds upon hundreds, until the darkness above became a sea of gentle light. The blurred figure stood beside him again, but this time they placed a small lantern into Morty's hands. It was warm, almost alive. Without being told, Morty released it, watching as it drifted upward to join the others. His chest swelled with a quiet ache, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. He whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure to whom, perhaps to the dream, perhaps to life itself. When he woke, Morty lay in bed longer than usual. He stared at the ceiling, imagining lanterns rising beyond the roof, beyond the sky, carrying with them the weight of countless forgotten moments. He thought about how many lives he had touched without even knowing it, how many times kindness had slipped from his hands like a lantern released into the air. He smiled softly, realizing he didn't need to remember them all. They were already rising, already shining somewhere. That day, Morty began to notice how even strangers carried lanterns of their own, subtle glows in their expressions, in their gestures, in the way they spoke to one another. He walked through town quietly, not
interfering, only witnessing.
Each person seemed like part of a constellation he was slowly learning to read. That night, as he drifted into sleep, Morty thought of the bridge, the library, the lanterns. He thought of the blurred figure whose silence had guided him more deeply than words ever could. He thought of Rick, of his sister, of the cat, of the tree. And for the first time, he whispered to himself, "I'm not afraid of the end."
I'm ready for the song to keep playing, even when I'm no longer listening. The dream that came was gentle. Morty stood once more in the field of tall grass beneath the stars. The blurred figure sat beside him now, both of them quiet, watching
the sky together. The stars moved slowly, forming shapes that resembled memories he had already lived. Morty leaned back into the grass, letting the cool blades cradle him. He didn't need answers. He didn't need clarity. He only needed this: stillness, presence, belonging. And in that dream, as he drifted further into rest, he realized that perhaps the greatest gift was not remembering every universe at once, but learning to rest within just one moment, held tenderly before letting it go. Morty awoke with the feeling that the world had grown quieter overnight. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint creak of the floorboards, even the distant barking of a dog, all of it seemed softened, as if wrapped in a blanket of stillness. He sat up slowly, letting the silence fill him. For once, he didn't feel the urge to move quickly or to fill the air with words. He simply breathed, long and steady, and let the morning hold him. When he stepped outside, the sky was pale with the first light of dawn. A thin mist lingered over the grass, curling gently around his shoes as he walked. Morty paused to watch it swirl, remembering the mist beneath the glowing bridge in his dreams. The connection felt deliberate, like the world was reminding him that waking and dreaming were not so different after all. He smiled faintly, whispering, "I see you," as though the mist itself were listening. Rick was still asleep, his head slumped on the couch, a book half open on his chest. Morty stood for a while, watching him. There was something tender in the way Rick's chest rose and fell, something almost childlike in the stillness of his features. Morty thought of all the universes he had seen, all the versions of Rick that existed. And yet, here was the one that mattered, sleeping in the quiet glow of the living room. Morty pulled a blanket from the chair and draped it gently over him. Rick stirred but did not wake, and Morty tiptoed away. The day passed like a gentle song. Morty wandered through the town again, not searching for anything, only observing. He watched an old man feed crumbs to the birds by the fountain. He noticed a young woman tying her child's shoe with patient care. He saw a shopkeeper sweeping his doorstep, pausing now and then to greet passers-by. None of these were extraordinary acts, yet each of them carried a weight of quiet love. Morty felt as though he were walking through a living museum, every moment a small masterpiece waiting to be noticed. By afternoon, he found himself back at the oak tree. The air was warm, the leaves casting dappled shadows across the ground. Morty leaned against the trunk and closed his eyes. He thought about the boy he had once been, the boy who was restless, anxious, desperate to understand everything at once. He felt a wave of tenderness for that younger self, as though he were a little brother who needed comforting. "You were doing your best," Morty whispered. "And look, we made it here." The thought filled him with a soft pride, not loud or boastful, but steady, like the heartbeat of the tree against his back. When sleep came that night, the dream began differently. Morty found himself in a vast hall filled with candles. They flickered gently, their light casting golden reflections across the floor. He walked slowly between them, sensing that each flame represented a memory, a life, or perhaps a universe. Some burned brightly, others low, but all of them together created a glow that was warm and endless. At the center of the hall stood the blurred figure once more, waiting. Morty approached, and this time, instead of asking questions, he simply stood beside them. The two of them watched the candles in silence, listening to the faint crackle of the flames. After a while, the figure placed a hand on Morty's shoulder. The gesture was simple, yet it carried more meaning than any answer could have. Morty closed his eyes, and in that touch he felt the weight of every universe he had ever remembered softened into something bearable, something human. When he opened his eyes again, the hall began to fade, replaced by a starlit sky. Morty lay back in the grass, the blurred figure beside him, both of them gazing upward. The stars pulsed gently, as though breathing in time with him. He felt no urgency, no fear. Only belonging. Morning light spilled across his face, waking him gently. Morty lay in bed for a long while, replaying the dream in his mind. He realized that answers had never been what he was searching for. What he needed was connection, and he had found it, not only in the dream, but in waking life too. That day, Morty spent time with his family. He sat with his sister while she painted her nails, listening to her chatter, even when he didn't fully follow her words. He played a slow game of chess with Rick, neither of them caring much about who won. He helped his mum set the table, noticing how her hands moved with practiced care. These were small things, almost invisible, yet they carried the weight of entire universes. As night fell, Morty stepped outside one last time. The air was cool, and the stars stretched endlessly above him. He thought of lanterns rising, of bridges glowing, of candles flickering in quiet halls. He thought of every dream that had carried him here, every small kindness that had kept him steady. And with a soft breath, he whispered to the sky, "I'm ready." He didn't mean ready for endings or beginnings. He meant ready for the song of life, with all its strange verses and quiet refrains, to continue in its own way. He meant ready to let go of the weight he had carried, to trust that it had already become part of the stars. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence, letting it fill him like a lullaby. And in that silence, he felt a presence, faint but steady, like the blurred figure resting just out of sight. He smiled, and sleep welcomed him like an old friend. The evening had fallen softly, like a blanket lowered from the sky. Morty sat on the steps outside the house, his elbows resting on his knees, watching the last streaks of orange fade into indigo. There was no hurry in him anymore. The days stretched differently now, slower, more deliberate, as though the universe itself had decided to walk beside him instead of rushing ahead. He found comfort in that change, in the way time seemed to breathe with him. He thought of the lantern dream again, how it had carried him across a bridge of light. For days he had wondered what it meant, but now he simply let the memory rest in his chest. Sometimes meaning wasn't something to chase, It was something that unfolded gently like a flower opening to the dawn. Morty let it stay unopened, trusting that its beauty was whole even if he didn't understand it. Rick came outside and sat beside him. He didn't say anything at first. He just lowered himself onto the step with a weary sigh, the kind that carried more years than words ever could. Morty glanced at him and smiled faintly. The two of them stared at the sky in silence. For once, the silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't awkward. It was like a language only they knew, a language made of all the moments they had shared, even the ones they had never spoken about. "Do you ever think," Morty asked softly, "that maybe the stars aren't far away at all? Like maybe they're just waiting for us to notice?" Rick scratched at his chin, eyes still fixed on the sky. "Could be," he said. His voice was tired, but not unkind. "Maybe they're closer than we think, or maybe they're just reflections
of ourselves, scattered out there so we don't forget." Morty didn't press for more. He let the answer hang in the air, delicate as mist.
Sometimes Rick gave him truths wrapped in riddles, and sometimes he gave him riddles wrapped in truth. Either way, they were gifts, and Morty was learning to hold them gently. That night, the dream returned, but it was different. Morty stood on a quiet shore, the water stretching out endlessly in front of him. The surface was calm, reflecting the stars like polished glass. He walked along the edge, the sand cool beneath his feet, and felt a deep peace settle over him. Then he saw something, small, ripples breaking the surface ahead. He stopped and waited. From the water rose tiny glowing fish, each one shimmering like a memory. They swam in slow arcs, circling him as though curious. Morty knelt down, and one of the glowing shapes brushed gently against his hand. In that touch, he felt something warm, something achingly familiar, like laughter shared at the dinner table, like the quiet patience of someone waiting for him, like the weight of Rick's blanket when Morty had once fallen asleep on the couch. The fish darted away, but the warmth lingered. Morty woke before dawn, tears resting lightly in the corners of his eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, they were something softer, like rain that nourishes the roots of a tree. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, and let them fall. He felt grateful, not just for the dream, but for the fact that dreams could carry such tenderness at all. Later that morning, Morty found himself walking into town again. He stopped at the bakery and bought bread still warm from the oven. He gave some to a stray cat in the alley, watching the way it sniffed cautiously before nibbling. He greeted the shopkeeper, who always hummed under his breath, and Morty noticed the way his tune shifted slightly when he smiled. Each small encounter filled Morty with a quiet joy. It wasn't the loud kind of joy that demanded attention, but the steady kind that built a home inside the heart. In the afternoon, Morty and Rick tinkered in the garage. They didn't invent anything extraordinary that day. The wires tangled, the tools clattered, and more than once Rick muttered something under his breath about wasted effort. But Morty noticed the way Rick's hands steadied when Morty held a part in place, the way their movements synced almost unconsciously. It wasn't about building something new. It was about building something together, even if the pieces never quite worked. As the sun dipped low, Morty walked back to the oak tree. He leaned against its trunk and closed his eyes, listening to the rustle of leaves above him. He thought of how many times he had returned here, how this tree had become a witness to his becoming. It reminded him that growth didn't happen in a rush. It happened slowly, in circles, like rings forming deep within the wood. The dream came once more, gentle as always. This time he found himself standing on the same shore, but the blurred figure was there too, waiting. Morty didn't ask questions. He simply walked beside them. They stood together, watching the glowing fish rise again, their light reflecting across the waves. Morty reached out, and the figure did the same. For a moment, their hands overlapped, and Morty felt the weight of countless universes pressing lightly against his palm. But it wasn't heavy. It was steady, like being held. When he opened his eyes in the morning, the world felt lighter. He didn't need to rush to understand. He didn't need to carry everything alone. He understood now that memory itself was a gift, that every small kindness, every quiet moment, every laugh, every silence, they all belonged somewhere, glowing, like fish beneath the surface, waiting to rise when needed. Morty lay back in his bed, hands folded on his chest, and let out a breath that seemed to last forever. The day ahead would come as it wished, and he would meet it as he was. He didn't need to be more than that. He already was enough. The air that morning was pale with mist, a silver veil stretched across the fields. Morty stepped outside, pulling his sweater close, and listened to the hush that always came before the sun climbed high. There was a stillness in everything, the grass bending beneath dew, the quiet creak of the porch, even the faint hum of the garage waiting for Rick to
stir.
It felt like the world was pausing with him, as though giving him permission to breathe a little longer before the day began. He walked slowly to the fence at the edge of the yard and placed his hands on the cool wood. Beyond it stretched the horizon, soft and endless. Morty thought of all the universes he had glimpsed, all the places where other versions of himself might be waking up right now. Some would be rushing into adventure, some stumbling into mistakes, some still curled under blankets. He didn't envy or pity them anymore. He just felt connected, like threads of one great fabric being tugged gently by the same unseen hand. Rick joined him a while later, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one down beside Morty without a word. Morty wrapped his hands around it, letting the warmth soak into his palms. They stood together like that for a long while, sipping quietly. Rick's hair was unkempt, his eyes heavy with years, yet in the soft morning light he looked almost peaceful. Morty realized, not for the first time, that even brilliance needed rest, that even the sharpest minds deserved stillness. "Remember, when you were little?" Rick said at last. "And you used to ask me if stars ever got lonely?" Morty smiled faintly, his breath forming clouds in the chill air. "Yeah, I remember. You never believed me when I told you no. You thought everything had to feel like you did." Morty turned to him, searching his face. "Do you think—"
I was wrong. Rick didn't answer right away. He tilted his mug, watching the ripples. Not wrong, just human.
His voice softened in a way Morty rarely heard. "Maybe stars do get lonely, or maybe they don't. Doesn't matter. What matters is that you cared enough to ask." Morty carried those words with him for the rest of the day. He thought of them when he passed the schoolyard where children played with reckless laughter. He thought of them when he sat beneath the oak tree, tracing the patterns of its bark. He thought of them when he returned home and watched Rick doze lightly in his chair, his head tilted back, his breathing steady. Caring was what tied it all together, the children running, the roots of the tree, the tired scientist who had seen too much. It was all stitched into the same fabric of care. That night, when the dream came, it was gentler still. Morty found himself not on the shore, but in a meadow under starlight. The grass swayed in long, slow waves, glowing faintly as though carrying its own secret light. The blurred figure was there again, sitting cross-legged on the ground. Morty joined them, without hesitation. For a while they just sat in silence, their eyes turned upward. Above them stretched the stars, not distant points, but living lanterns drifting slowly, humming faintly. The figure spoke at last, their voice soft, like wind moving through leaves. "Do you see? They're not far, they're not cold. They've
always been close." Morty nodded. He didn't ask questions. He just let the words settle inside him like seeds.
He closed his eyes and listened to the hum of the stars, a lullaby older than memory. When he awoke, the sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Morty lay still for a long time, listening to the birds outside his window. He realized something then, that he no longer felt the need to chase the dream. It would come when it wished, and it would bring what it needed to bring. His task wasn't to demand or control. His task was simply to receive. Later, Morty walked into the small town again. He stopped to help an elderly man gather fallen fruit into a basket. He held the door for a woman whose arms were full of books. He bent down to tie the shoelace of a little boy before he tripped. Each moment was small, almost forgettable, but each one left a ripple, as though the universe itself sighed softly, in gratitude. When he returned home, Rick was awake and fiddling with something at the workbench. Morty leaned against the doorway, watching him. For a moment he thought about saying thank you for the coffee, for the silence, for the years, but the words felt unnecessary. Rick glanced up, met his eyes and gave a faint nod. That was enough. Evening fell once more. Morty sat by the window with the lamp turned low. He thought of all the universes he might never see again, all the versions of himself that would remain strangers, and yet he felt no loss. It was enough to know they existed, enough to know they were out there living their quiet stories. He placed his hand against the glass, as though reaching toward them, and whispered, "Be safe. Be kind." The night deepened. Morty crawled beneath his blanket, pulling it close around his shoulders. He closed his eyes and let the hum of the stars follow him into sleep. The air that morning was pale with mist, a silver veil stretched across the fields. Morty stepped outside, pulling his sweater close, and listened to the hush that always came before the sun climbed high. There was a stillness in everything, the grass bending beneath dew, the quiet creak of the porch, even the faint hum of the garage waiting for Rick to stir. It felt like the world was pausing with him, as though giving him permission to breathe a little longer before the day began. He walked slowly to the fence at the edge of the yard and placed his hands on the cool wood. Beyond it stretched the horizon, soft and endless. Morty thought of all the universes he had glimpsed, all the places where other versions of himself might be waking up right now. Some would be rushing into adventure, some stumbling into mistakes, some still curled under blankets. He didn't envy or pity them anymore. He just felt connected, like threads of one great fabric being tugged gently by the same unseen hand. Rick joined him a while later, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one down beside Morty without a word. Morty wrapped his hands around it, letting the warmth soak into his palms. They stood together like that for a long while, sipping quietly. Rick's hair was unkempt, his eyes heavy with years, yet in the soft morning light he looked almost peaceful. Morty realized, not for the first time, that even brilliance needed rest, that even the sharpest minds deserved stillness. "Remember when you were little," Rick said at last, "and you used to ask me if stars ever got lonely?" Morty smiled faintly, his breath forming clouds in the chill air. "Yeah, I remember. You never believed me when I told you no. You thought everything had to feel like you did." Morty turned to him, searching his face. "Do you think—"
I was wrong. Rick didn't answer right away. He tilted his mug, watching the ripples. Not wrong, just human.
His voice softened in a way Morty rarely heard. "Maybe stars do get lonely, or maybe they don't. Doesn't matter. What matters is that you cared enough to ask." Morty carried those words with him for the rest of the day. He thought of them when he passed the schoolyard where children played with reckless laughter. He thought of them when he sat beneath the oak tree, tracing the patterns of its bark. He thought of them when he returned home and watched Rick doze lightly in his chair, his head tilted back, his breathing steady. Caring was what tied it all together, the children running, the roots of the tree, the tired scientist who had seen too much. It was all stitched into the same fabric of care. That night, when the dream came, it was gentler still. Morty found himself not on the shore, but in a meadow under starlight. The grass swayed in long, slow waves, glowing faintly as though carrying its own secret light. The blurred figure was there again, sitting cross-legged on the ground. Morty joined them, without hesitation. For a while they just sat in silence, their eyes turned upward. Above them stretched the stars, not distant points, but living lanterns drifting slowly, humming faintly. The figure spoke at last, their voice soft, like wind moving through leaves. "Do you see? They're not far, they're not cold, they've
Always been close." Morty nodded. He didn't ask questions. He just let the words settle inside him like seeds.
He closed his eyes and listened to the hum of the stars, a lullaby older than memory. When he awoke, the sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Morty lay still for a long time, listening to the birds outside his window. He realized something then, that he no longer felt the need to chase the dream. It would come when it wished, and it would bring what it needed to bring. His task wasn't to demand or control. His task was simply to receive. Later, Morty walked into the small town again. He stopped to help an elderly man gather fallen fruit into a basket. He held the door for a woman whose arms were full of books. He bent down to tie the shoelace of a little boy before he tripped. Each moment was small, almost forgettable, but each one left a ripple, as though the universe itself sighed softly in gratitude. When he returned home, Rick was awake and fiddling with something at the workbench. Morty leaned against the doorway, watching him. For a moment he thought about saying thank you for the coffee, for the silence, for the years, but the words felt unnecessary. Rick glanced up, met his eyes and gave a faint nod. That was enough. Evening fell once more. Morty sat by the window with the lamp turned low. He thought of all the universes he might never see again, all the versions of himself that would remain strangers. And yet he felt no loss. It was enough to know they existed, enough to know they were out there living their quiet stories. He placed his hand against the glass, as though reaching toward them, and whispered, "Be safe. Be kind." The night deepened. Morty crawled beneath his blanket, pulling it close around his shoulders. He closed his eyes and let the hum of the stars follow him into sleep. The air carried a gentleness that night, as though the world itself had slowed to match Morty's breathing. He had begun to notice things he once overlooked, the hush between cricket songs, the faint silver shimmer that clung to the grass after dew, the way even silence had its own rhythm. Each detail seemed to lean toward him, reminding him that he belonged to a living world, even when he felt apart from it. Rick had been quieter too. His inventions were fewer now, and the hum of machinery from the garage no longer stretched deep into the night. Morty wondered if Rick was tired, or simply content with less. Whatever the reason, it softened the house. Their nights together were slower, marked by shared glances more than conversations, by the unspoken bond of two people who had walked through storms and found themselves still standing. One late evening, Morty carried 2 mugs of tea to the back steps. Rick raised an eyebrow at the sight of his own, muttered something under his breath, but drank it anyway. They sat side by side in the cool air, steam curling up into the dark. "Morty," Rick said finally, voice low and rough, "you ever think maybe that he—"
Point isn't fixing things. Maybe it's just noticing them. Letting them be what they are. Morty sipped his tea, the warmth filling him. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he thought of the cat on the fence, of the meadow in his dreams, of the people
he loved and lost. When he did speak, it was barely more than a whisper. "Yeah, I think maybe that's the only way it works." Rick gave a small grunt that might have been agreement. The two of them stayed like that, the night thick around them, until their mugs were empty and their eyelids heavy. Sleep found Morty with ease, carrying him once again to the dream meadow. The blurred figure was waiting, but they looked different now, less distant, more whole, though still not entirely clear. They sat together on the glowing grass, and Morty felt no need to ask questions. He simply leaned back, gazing at the lanterns.
overhead. "They're closer," Morty murmured, watching the lights shimmer. The figure nodded. "Because you've let them be. You're not holding them by force. You're letting them arrive." Morty felt the words settle gently inside him.
Not as knowledge, but as something deeper, something lived. He closed his eyes and listened to the quiet hum of the meadow, the sound like a lullaby he had always known but forgotten. When he woke, the sun was just beginning to rise. Pale light spilled across his blanket, turning the edges gold. Morty lay still for a long while, letting the moment soak into him. He thought of how mornings used to feel urgent, full of things to do, problems to solve. Now mornings felt like invitations, gentle openings, not demands. He moved through the day, without hurry. He swept the porch, fed the birds that gathered near the oak tree, and walked the slow path through town. People greeted him softly, not expecting much, simply acknowledging his presence. Morty returned each gesture with a smile, finding comfort in the simplicity of being seen. That evening, the sky shifted into shades of violet and rose. Morty stood on the small hill again, looking down at the town lights flickering awake one by one. He thought of the stars, of what Rick had said, that even when they looked lonely, they weren't. Morty wondered if the lights below were the same, each window glowing not in isolation, but in quiet harmony with the others. On his walk back, he stopped by the fence where the cat often perched. Tonight, it was waiting for him, tail curled neatly around its paws. Morty knelt, scratching gently behind its ears. The cat purred, and for a moment, Morty imagined the sound carrying far beyond the fence, weaving into the night, reaching places unseen. He whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure to whom, the cat, the night, or simply the mystery of connection itself. Later, as Morty prepared for sleep, Rick passed by his doorway. He paused, leaning against the frame, his silhouette softened by the hall light. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Rick said, "You've gotten steadier, Morty. I notice it, even if I don't say it." Morty met his gaze, a warmth blooming in his chest. "Thanks, Rick. I just
stopped fighting myself so much." Rick gave a short nod, almost embarrassed, then turned away.
But Morty caught the faintest trace of relief in his shoulders as he walked down the hall. When Morty lay down, pulling the blanket close, he thought about how far they had come, not through grand battles or impossible victories, but through quiet moments, through learning to notice instead of forcing, to rest instead of endlessly striving. The lesson felt simple, almost too simple, yet it filled him with a peace deeper than anything he had known. The night air pressed softly against the window. Morty closed his eyes, letting his breath match its rhythm. In the space between waking and dreams, he felt the meadow return, not as something separate, but as part of himself now, woven into his being, steady and luminous. He whispered a final thought into the dark, a truth he wanted to remember, even as sleep pulled him under. "It's
enough just to be here."
The words lingered in the stillness, folding gently into the quiet night, as though the universe itself had been waiting to agree. The night arrived without hurry, as though it had been waiting for Morty all along. The sky was a deep velvet blue, stars scattered like quiet promises, and the air was cool with the gentle hush that follows a long day. Morty sat by the window, his head resting lightly against the glass, watching the town lights glimmer below. They seemed softer than usual, as though the world itself had lowered its voice so he could hear the quiet inside himself. He felt older, though not in years. It was something quieter than age, something woven from memory and tenderness. He thought of the countless worlds he had glimpsed, the countless selves he had carried within him, and how strange it was that all of them led back here to this ordinary house, this simple night, this steady breath. For once, he didn't feel the need to hold it all together. He allowed it to rest, like leaves drifting on a calm stream. Rick came to stand behind him, hands tucked in the pockets of his worn coat. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked out at the sky with Morty, sharing the silence like it was a kind of language. Eventually, he murmured, "You know, Morty, I used to think the multiverse was endless noise, just chaos repeating itself forever. But maybe it's more like this. Just a lot of small lights, each one soft, each one enough." Morty smiled faintly. "Yeah, I think that too. And I think I'm okay just being one of
them." Rick's eyes softened, though his mouth stayed firm. He gave a quiet nod, then left Morty alone with the stars. Later, as Morty lay down beneath his blanket, he thought of all the faces he had known, his family, his friends, even the strangers who had brushed through his story like wind through trees. He thought of the blurred figure in his meadow dreams, and how they had slowly grown clearer with each passing night. That night, as he drifted into sleep, he saw them once more, yet this time they weren't blurred at all. They looked like Morty himself, but gentler, brighter, as though the dream had been showing him all along the part of himself he had forgotten. The figures smiled, not with triumph, but with peace. Together they sat in the glowing grass of the meadow, lanterns swaying above them like slow heartbeats. No words were spoken. None were needed.
Morty felt whole. Not because he had found an answer, but because he no longer needed one. The meadow faded into the quiet of real night. Morty stirred slightly, then stilled. His breathing was deep, steady, like the ocean folding itself again and again onto the shore. Outside, the town lay wrapped in sleep, windows dark, streets hushed. Even Rick, in his workshop, had let his tools rest. The house was finally still. A thought came to Morty just before he fully surrendered to sleep. That his story was not one of victories or conquests, but of gentle arrivals. He had learned not by chasing, but by noticing. Not by grasping, but by letting go. And perhaps that was enough. More than enough. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, patient and unhurried. If they carried his memory, they did so softly, without weight, without burden. The universe did not demand from him. It only asked that he exist, that he breathe, that he be one light among many. His final dream was simple. He was walking through the meadow, but this time there were no blurred figures, no mysteries waiting at the edge of sight. There was only the grass, the lanterns, and the hum of the earth. He lay down on the soft ground, closed his eyes, and felt the sky cradle him. A whisper moved through the air, not from outside, but from within him. It said, "You are safe. You are loved. You can rest now." Morty let the words drift through him like a lullaby, letting them settle in every place that had ever felt afraid or uncertain. His breath deepened. His body grew lighter. Sleep came not as a surrender, but as a homecoming. And with that, he stretched quietly into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.
Man,